Abigail Turner pressed her trembling hand flat against the closed bedroom door and held her breath. She had expected the door to open. She had expected Hand's obligation, the cold silence of a man claiming what a marriage contract gave him. But the footsteps on the other side stopped. A blanket appeared under the door, folded neatly, slid across the floorboards without a single word, and then Benjamin Hawthorne walked away. She hadn't expected kindness. Kindness was so much harder to carry than cruelty. If this story already has your heart subscribed to our channel, follow every part to the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1817 sat heavy over Massachusetts like a wool coat that wouldn't come off. The air smelled of cut hay, and something underneath it, damp earth-old wood, the particular quiet of a house that had been holding its breath for years. Abigail Turner had never been inside Hawthorne Manor before the day she became its mistress. She'd seen it from the road. Everyone in Harwick had seen it from the road. A large clapboard estate, set back from the elm trees, the kind of house that suggested money without announcing it, the kind of house that had learned to keep its feelings to itself. She had looked at it the way you look at a church you've never worshipped in. Carefully, with a strange private respect. Now she stood inside it wearing a dress that wasn't quite hers, borrowed from the widow Perkins down the lane, taken in at the waist with her own needle the night before, and she understood that the house had been watching her the same way she'd been watching it. The ceremony had been short. A justice of the peace named Mr. Aldrich, who smelled of pipe tobacco and didn't meet her eyes once. 2 witnesses she didn't know. A ring pressed onto her finger by a hand she had shaken but not held. And then it was done. Abigail Turner became Abigail Hawthorne, in the time it took a clock to move from 10:30 to 11:15. Benjamin Hawthorne had not smiled during the ceremony. He had not frowned either. He had simply stood beside her with the contained composure of a man signing a business agreement. And she had thought, standing there with her bouquet of white clover, she'd picked herself from the roadside. At least he's honest about what this is. She respected honesty. It was rare enough to be worth something. The carriage ride to the estate was 12 minutes. She counted. He sat across from her and looked out the window, and she looked out hers, and the wheels turned and neither of them spoke. Not because there was hostility between them, but because there wasn't yet anything else. Mrs. Eleanor Briggs met them at the front door. She was a tall woman, 60 years old, if she was a day, with iron gray hair pulled back so tightly it looked like an act of personal discipline. She looked at Abigail the way a horse trader looks at an animal whose papers he doesn't quite trust. Not unkind exactly, but measuring. Cataloging. Deciding where the weaknesses were likely to be. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said, and the title landed between them like something dropped from a height. "Mrs. Briggs?" Abigail answered. She kept her voice even. "The children are in bed. Mr. Hawthorne gave instructions that they were not to be woken for the reception." "There was no reception," Benjamin said behind her. "There was a ceremony. It's finished." He moved past both of them without ceremony of his own, handed his coat to a young man Abigail hadn't noticed standing in the hall, and walked toward the staircase. "Mrs. Briggs, show Mrs. Hawthorne to her rooms. She'll want to rest." That was the first time Abigail heard him say her new name, Mrs. Hawthorne. It came out of his mouth the way he said everything contained deliberate, shaped by some interior decision to give nothing away. She turned to watch him go. His back was straight. His shoulders carried nothing visible. Rooms, she noted. Not room, plural. "This way," said Mrs. Briggs, and her tone made it clear she was not asking. The rooms were on the second floor east wing. 2 of them, a sitting room with a writing desk and a small window seat, and a bedroom beyond it. The bedroom had fresh linens, white curtains, a lamp burning low on the nightstand. It was a careful room, prepared for someone, but it did not feel like it had been prepared for her specifically, more like it had been made ready for the general concept of a wife, and she'd simply arrived to fill the vacancy. "The master's rooms are across the hall," Mrs. Briggs said. "He keeps his own hours. You'll learn them." "Thank you," Abigail said. "Breakfast is at 7. The children eat with him on Saturdays. Other mornings they eat in the nursery." Mrs. Briggs paused at the door. The previous Mrs. Hawthorne preferred, "Mrs. Briggs?" Abigail said it gently. Not sharply, she had no sharpness to spare, not tonight. I'd like to learn the house in my own time if that's all right. I don't want to inherit habits. I want to understand the place. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not warmth, but the faint grudging acknowledgement that the girl standing before her was not entirely a fool. Very well, she said, and left. Abigail sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment. She folded her hands in her lap and let the house settle around her, the sounds of it, the cooling wood, the distant drip of something somewhere in the pipes, the occasional creak of footfall from across the hall. She had made a practical decision. That was what she told herself. A girl of 23 with no family, no income, no particular prospects beyond the tutoring work she'd pieced together for 3 years. A girl in that position does not have the luxury of waiting for love. She had taken an offer that was honest about what it was, and she would honor it honestly in return. She would manage his house. She would be kind to his children. She would not pretend to feelings she didn't have, and she would not expect feelings that weren't offered. She was not afraid. She had been afraid before in harder circumstances than these, and she knew what real fear felt like. This was something else. Uncertainty, maybe. The particular loneliness of standing in a room full of someone else's furniture. She reached up and unpinned her hair. Let it fall. And then there were footsteps in the hall. She heard them stop outside her door. She didn't move. Her hands stilled in her hair. A knock. Once. Quiet. She crossed to the door and opened it. Benjamin Hawthorne stood there in his shirt sleeves. No coat, no cravat. He had already come undone from the day, and he looked different for it. Younger somehow, less armored. He was holding a folded blanket, heavy wool, the kind meant for winter. She looked at the blanket, then at him. The nights get cold in this house, he said. Even in July. The walls don't hold the heat the way they should. I'm not cold, she said. And she wasn't. The room was perfectly warm. He held the blanket out anyway. Take it. She took it, held it against her chest, and waited. He looked at her steadily, not unkindly, not warmly, but with an attention she hadn't expected. Like he was looking at her, and actually seeing what he'd agreed to. What he'd brought into this house. I want to say something to you, he said, and I'd like you to believe me. All right, you didn't come here for nothing. I know that. I know what you left behind, and I know what this arrangement is. I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't. He paused. But I'm also not going to make demands of you that weren't part of what was agreed. You're here to run this house and help me raise my children. That's enough. That's all I need. Abigail looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a night bird called once and went silent. You mean the marriage won't? No. He said it quietly. Not unless you want it to. And I'll tell you plainly, I don't expect you to. She hadn't realized until that moment how tightly she'd been holding something inside her chest. Some braced-for-it readiness, some preparation she'd spent the last 3 weeks constructing. It didn't dissolve. It couldn't dissolve that fast, but it shifted, loosened slightly. Mr. Hawthorne, she said. Benjamin. She considered that. Benjamin. It was the first time she'd said his given name. It sat oddly in her mouth like a word in a language she was still learning. Thank you. He nodded. And then he turned and went back across the hall, and she heard his door close not sharply, not finally, just quietly, and she stood there in her doorway, holding a winter blanket in the middle of summer, and thought that she had absolutely no idea what kind of man this was. She met the children the next morning. Thomas came first because Thomas never did anything second if he could help it. He was 8 years old, compact and fierce, with a smear of ink on his left thumb that suggested he'd already been at his lessons before breakfast. He appeared in the doorway of the dining room before Abigail had taken her seat, planted his feet wide, and looked at her. Are you the new wife? He asked. Thomas. Mrs. Briggs' voice came from the kitchen carrying a warning. I am, Abigail said. Are you Thomas? Yes. He considered her. My father says you used to be a teacher. A governess, close enough. Are you going to try to be my mother? The directness of it hit her somewhere under the ribs. She kept her face easy. "No. You already had a mother. I wouldn't try to replace her." Something in his expression unclenched slightly. He was still watching her, still assessing the way children do when they've learned that adults are not always what they seem. But there was less armor in it than there'd been a moment before. "All right," he said, and sat down at the table as if the matter were settled. Emily came down later, 12 years old, with her father's careful composure, already worn like a borrowed coat, too large for her but worn earnestly. She shook Abigail's hand when they were introduced, said, "Good morning, ma'am," in a voice she was clearly working to keep steady, and took her seat. She didn't ask questions the way Thomas did. She observed, she catalogued. She was her father's daughter in ways that probably cost her. "Your dress is blue," Emily said eventually. "It is. Mama used to say blue was for loyalty." Abigail looked at the girl. "That's a lovely thing to say." Emily turned back to her plate. But she didn't leave the table early the way Mrs. Briggs had suggested she might. She stayed through the entire meal, and when Abigail passed the bread, Emily took it and said thank you. It was small. It was very small. But Abigail understood that in this house, small things were where everything actually happened. Benjamin Hawthorne left for his business affairs by 8 every morning and returned by 4, and in the hours between Abigail learned the house. She did it the way she'd always done things, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing her intentions. She walked every room. She spoke to every servant by name. She found that the kitchen garden had been let go since spring, that Thomas's tutor was missing 3 essential texts, that the household accounts had a discrepancy in the column for lamp oil that no one had addressed in 4 months. Small things, practical things. She fixed them, quietly, without making a proclamation of it. On the 4th day, she asked Mrs. Briggs to show her how the household ledger was organized. Mrs. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. "Why?" "Because I'd like to manage it going forward. That's what I'm here for." "Mr. Hawthorne reviews the accounts himself." "I know. I'd like to present them to him in better order. It'll save him time." Mrs. Briggs handed over the ledger. She didn't do it warmly, but she did it, and Abigail understood that as the first fractional shift of a very heavy thing. Benjamin said nothing about the lamp oil discrepancy when she brought it to him that evening. He simply looked at the ledger, looked at her correction, and nodded. "Good," he said. She had not been looking for praise, but she noted the nod, filed it away. On the 6th day, she found Emily sitting alone in the garden, holding a book she wasn't reading. Abigail sat on the bench beside her without asking. She'd brought her own book. She opened it. They sat in silence for a while, not uncomfortable silence, just quiet, the kind that 2 people can share without explaining it. "Do you miss your own family?" Emily asked eventually. "I don't have any," Abigail said. "Not anymore." Emily absorbed this. "Did it hurt when you lost them?" "Yes. There was no point softening it. It still does sometimes, but it becomes something you can carry." "I don't know if I can carry it," Emily said quietly. Abigail looked at the girl, this 12-year-old, with her careful composure and her borrowed stoicism, and felt something in her own chest move. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said. "That's the part no one tells you." Emily didn't cry. She just looked down at her book, and then after a moment she turned to the page she'd been trying to read and actually started reading, as if something had been given her permission. They sat there together for an hour, and it was the first hour Abigail spent in Hawthorne Manor that felt in some faint and tentative way like belonging. It was on the 9th day that Charlotte Winslow arrived. She came in a hired carriage, well appointed, polished, the kind of vehicle selected to make an impression, and she came without notice, without invitation, and without the courtesy of sending word ahead. Mrs. Briggs showed her to the sitting room with the particular stiffness of someone who has been taught to be polite to people she doesn't trust. Abigail came downstairs to find a woman of perhaps 58 seated on the settee, with the posture of someone who had decided before entering the room that everything in it was beneath her. She was dressed in deep gray, Not mourning, but close to it, and she wore her silver hair pinned severely, and her expression the same way. "You must be the new wife," Charlotte Winslow said, looking at Abigail with the thoroughness of an inventory. "I am. You must be Mrs. Winslow." Abigail had heard the name. She'd heard it from Mrs. Briggs, in a low, careful voice, the way people speak about things they're afraid of. Charlotte Winslow, mother of the late Mrs. Hawthorne. A difficult woman. "I've come to see the children. They're with their tutor at the moment. I can let Mr. Hawthorne know you're here. I didn't come to see Benjamin." Charlotte's eyes didn't move from Abigail's face. "I came to see my grandchildren, and to meet the woman my son-in-law has seen fit to install in my daughter's house." Abigail felt the intent behind the words, "the weight of my daughter's house," and kept her face easy. "I'll see that Thomas and Emily finish their lessons early. In the meantime, may I offer you tea, Mrs. Winslow? I won't be staying long. Tea anyway," Abigail said pleasantly, and went to ask Mrs. Briggs. She stood in the kitchen doorway long enough to draw one slow breath. Then she smoothed her apron and went back in. She understood in the way that people who've lived without safety for a long time understand things that Charlotte Winslow had not come to visit. She had come to look, to measure, to find out exactly what kind of threat Abigail Turner represented to something Charlotte had decided already belonged to her. The children came downstairs. Thomas greeted his grandmother with the careful wariness of a boy who'd been here before. Emily smiled smaller, more guarded than usual, and submitted to being embraced. "You've grown thin," Charlotte told Emily, examining her. "I'm fine, grandmother." "Children grow thin when there's disruption in the home." Charlotte said this without looking at Abigail, which meant she intended Abigail to hear it perfectly. "I've been eating very well," Thomas said flatly. Abigail showed Mrs. Briggs how to make the porridge properly. Charlotte's gaze went to him, then to Abigail, and in that look Abigail saw it clearly, the shape of what was coming. Not a greeting, not a beginning, a declaration. Benjamin returned at 4 to find his mother-in-law in his sitting room and his new wife serving her tea with an unruffled competence that looked on the surface like perfect hospitality. He stopped in the doorway. Something moved through his face. Not surprise, not quite more, like the controlled recognition of a man seeing a situation he has already in some part of himself been expecting. "Charlotte," he said. "Benjamin." She rose, offered her cheek. He kissed it. His eyes went briefly to Abigail, and in that brief glance, she saw something she hadn't expected, not alarm, but a quiet, steady apology. As if he were saying, "I should have warned you." She gave the smallest tilt of her head. "I'm all right." Charlotte watched this exchange, watched it with the sharpness of a woman who has spent decades reading rooms, and her expression shifted into something that looked like a smile. "Your new wife is very capable," she said. "The house seems well in hand." "It is," Benjamin said. "I'm glad." A pause. "I do worry, of course, about the children, about whether this arrangement," and she said the word with the careful precision of a scalpel, "gives them everything they need. They're well. For now." She gathered her gloves. "I'll see myself out, but I'll call again soon." She turned to Abigail, smiled. "It's been a pleasure, Mrs. Hawthorne." When the carriage had gone, Benjamin stood in the sitting room doorway for a long moment. Abigail was straightening the cups. "How long was she here?" he asked. "An hour, perhaps." "Did she—" He stopped, started again. "Did she say anything that concerned you?" Abigail considered telling him all of it. The inventory look, the "my daughter's house," the comment about thin children. She considered it, and then she set down the last cup and turned to face him. "She came to decide something," Abigail said. "I don't think she's decided it yet." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, the faintest crease of what might in a less guarded man have looked like relief. "She wants the children," he said quietly. "She's been saying for 2 years that they belong with her, that they'd be better in Boston." Abigail felt the word land. "Wants." "She can't take them," she said. "She can try." His jaw tightened. "And she has money enough to try for a long time." They stood there in the cooling room, the summer evening coming in through the windows, and Abigail thought, this is what I didn't know I was walking into. Not the house, not the children, not the careful silence of a man who'd stopped expecting warmth. This. The thing at the edges of it waiting. Then we'll need to give her nothing to work with, Abigail said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slow, once the way he did when something had been settled. All right, he said. And that was the first time Abigail Hawthorne understood that her marriage was going to require something more than competence and patience. It was going to require her to fight. The morning after Charlotte Winslow's visit, Abigail woke before 5. She didn't lie in bed the way she used to back in the boarding house on Clement Street, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the day to give her permission to begin. She got up, she dressed, she braided her hair without a mirror, and went downstairs while the house was still holding the dark. Mrs. Briggs was already in the kitchen. The older woman looked up from the stove without surprise, which told Abigail that Mrs. Briggs had been waking at this hour for decades and had learned not to expect anyone to join her. She said nothing. Abigail said nothing. Abigail found a mug, poured herself coffee from the pot, and sat at the kitchen table and opened the household ledger she'd brought down with her. They worked in parallel for 20 minutes before Mrs. Briggs spoke. She comes 3-4 times a year, she said, not looking up from the pot she was stirring. Always without warning, always in that same carriage. Has she ever taken the children? She's tried. A pause. First time was 3 months after Mrs. Catherine died. She came with a lawyer. Mr. Hawthorne sent them both off the property. Abigail turned a page. And since then, she writes letters to the magistrate, to the church council, to anyone she thinks might listen. Mrs. Briggs set down her spoon, turned, looked at Abigail directly for what felt like the first time. She's telling people this house isn't fit, that the children aren't being cared for properly. Is she telling people that now? Since the wedding. Mrs. Briggs's expression answered before her words did. The letter to Reverend Alcott went out last week. Abigail closed the ledger. She sat with that for a moment, the shape of it, the speed of it. Charlotte hadn't waited. Of course she hadn't. She'd been waiting for a reason, and Abigail's arrival had given her a fresh one. Thank you, Abigail said, for telling me. Mrs. Briggs turned back to the stove. But something had shifted between them, something small and significant, the way the first crack in river ice sounds before the whole surface moves. Breakfast will be ready at 7, the older woman said. I'll be here, Abigail answered. She took her ledger and her coffee and went back upstairs to think. She had a great deal to think about. The most immediate problem was not Charlotte. Charlotte was a future problem, the kind that required preparation rather than reaction. The most immediate problem was simpler and more personal. She did not yet understand this house well enough to protect it. And she needed to understand it, quickly. Because a woman like Charlotte Winslow didn't give her opponents time to find their footing. Abigail spread the ledger open on her writing desk and went through it column by column in the gray morning light. 4 months of lamp oil discrepancies she'd already corrected. A quarterly payment to a Dr. Marsh that appeared irregularly and without notation. Illness medicines, a standing arrangement of some kind. A tuition entry for Thomas's lessons that was higher than it should have been by $8. And an entry for Emily's music instruction that had simply stopped in January and never resumed. She wrote these things down, not as accusations, as questions. She would need answers before she could build anything solid. When Benjamin came down to breakfast, she was waiting. He paused when he saw her at the table, not with displeasure, but with the slight recalibration of a man who has grown used to mornings alone. He took his seat. Mrs. Briggs brought eggs and bread. The children came down in stages, Thomas first ink-thumbed and bright-eyed Emily behind him, quieter, watchful. They ate. The children talked. Thomas had opinions about everything, and he expressed them at length about his Latin lesson about a bird's nest he'd found in the oak tree by the east fence, about whether horses could tell when rain was coming. Emily corrected him twice on points of fact, and was right both times. Abigail watched Benjamin watch his children. He didn't say much, but he listened to every word. She could see it in the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved between Thomas and Emily, with a focus that had nothing performative about it. He was not a man who showed love easily, but it was there. It was absolutely there. And it was the most unguarded thing about him. She waited until the children had gone, Thomas to his tutor, Emily to her needlework, before she slid her list of questions across the table. Benjamin looked at it, then at her. "The lamp oil discrepancy is corrected," she said. "The tutoring overpayment needs to be addressed with Mr. Foster. But the payment to Dr. Marsh is the one I wanted to ask you about directly." He was quiet for a moment. "Thomas had a fever last winter. It lasted longer than it should have." "How long?" "6 weeks. His voice didn't change, but something tightened behind his eyes. "There were 2 nights when we didn't know." Abigail absorbed this. 6 weeks of fever. 2 nights of not knowing. She thought of the boy downstairs with his ink-stained thumb and his opinions about horses, and something in her chest pulled tight. "Is he fully recovered?" she asked. "Dr. Marsh says so." A pause. "Thomas says so louder." Despite everything, she almost smiled. And Emily's music instruction. Benjamin set down his coffee cup. "She stopped wanting to play. After her mother died. I didn't force it." "Of course not." She pulled the list back, made a note. "I won't force it either, but I'd like to keep the option open for her if she comes back to it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize, not quite surprise, but a kind of recalibration, like something kept not landing where he expected it to. "Mrs. Briggs told me about the letter to Reverend Alcott," Abigail said. He went still. "Charlotte moves fast," she continued, keeping her voice even. "I think we should move faster. Abigail, I'm not suggesting anything dramatic. I'm suggesting we give this house a foundation she can't erode." She met his eyes. "The children need to be seen at church in town in good order. The household needs to be running well enough that no one can reasonably point at it and call it disordered. And you and I need to appear to anyone paying attention like 2 people who are building something, not 2 people who signed a piece of paper." He was watching her with that careful measuring attention again. "You've thought about this," he said. "Since approximately 3:30 this morning," she said. "Yes." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, but its cousin. It was the closest she'd seen him come to it. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" "Information, mostly. I need to know who in Harwick is sympathetic to Charlotte's claims, and who isn't. I need to know who has standing in this community and what they think of you. And I need to know what Charlotte is actually after, because I don't think it's the children." That landed. She saw it land. "What do you mean?" he said quietly. "I've been thinking about what Mrs. Briggs told me. The letters to the magistrate. The lawyer she brought the first time. That's not the behavior of a grandmother who misses her grandchildren." Abigail folded her hands on the table. "That's the behavior of a woman pursuing a legal strategy. What does your wife's estate include?" Benjamin was very still. "Catherine's portion," he said finally. "A trust her father established. It passes to the children when they reach majority, Thomas at 21, Emily at 25. But if the children were to be placed in Charlotte's care—" "She controls the trust," Abigail said. "Until they're of age, yes." The table was quiet. Outside, a bird called. Thomas's voice floated up from somewhere below, arguing cheerfully about something with his tutor. "How much?" Abigail asked. "Enough," Benjamin said, "that it's worth 12 years of legal effort." She nodded slowly. She'd suspected it. The instinct had been there since Charlotte walked into the sitting room, but having it confirmed changed something. Made it colder. Made it clearer. "Then she's not going to stop," Abigail said. "No. And we need a lawyer of our own. I have one. James Alcott, the Reverend's brother. He's handled estate matters before. Have him review the trust documents again, and anything Charlotte has filed with the magistrate. I want to know exactly what she's claimed." Abigail stood gathering her papers. "I'll handle the household side of things. If anyone comes asking questions about the children or the state of this house, they'll find nothing to criticize." He was looking at her with something she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude, it was harder than gratitude. more like the expression of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just unexpectedly been offered help. "You came to run a house," he said, "not to fight a legal battle." "I came to take care of this family," she said. "The house is part of it. So is this." She left him with his coffee and went to find Thomas's tutor. The work of the next 2 weeks was the kind of work Abigail understood: methodical, consistent, built on small daily acts rather than grand gestures. She reorganized the kitchen stores and presented the corrected accounting to Benjamin at the end of each week. She arranged for Emily's music instructor to begin again on Tuesday afternoons, leaving the invitation open without pressure, and Emily picked up her scales the very first morning. She worked with Thomas's tutor to fill the gaps in the boys' Latin texts, and within 3 days Thomas was grudgingly admitting that the new grammar book was marginally better than the old one. She also went to church. She went every Sunday, and she went early, and she stood where people could see her. She learned names. She remembered them. She asked after Mrs. Alcott's ailing hip, and Mr. Fletcher's new barn, and the school teacher's mother who'd come to live with the family from Hartford. She was not performing warmth, she genuinely had it, but she was also fully aware that warmth in a small town in Massachusetts in 1817 was currency. And she intended to spend it wisely. Benjamin escorted them on the third Sunday. He stood beside her in the churchyard after the service, and she noticed with the observational precision she'd been refining since childhood how people responded to him. With respect mostly. A few with warmth. And 3, she counted precisely 3, with a careful neutrality that suggested they were waiting to see which way the wind blew before committing. Those were the ones Charlotte had reached. "The Aldrich family," she said to Benjamin on the walk back low enough that only he could hear. "Yes," he said without asking how she knew. "And Widow Marsh? And Deacon Cullen?" He glanced at her sideways. "You were paying attention." "I'm always paying attention," she said. Thomas, walking ahead of them, stepped squarely into a puddle, soaking his boot, and turned around with an expression of pure philosophical disgust that made Emily cover her mouth and made Benjamin briefly, very briefly close his eyes against what almost looked like a laugh. Abigail watched that not-quite laugh and filed it away next to the nod and the recalibration and the quality of his attention when his children spoke. She was building a picture. She was doing it carefully with the diligence she brought to everything. She was also, though she would not have named it this way, starting to understand what kind of man Benjamin Hawthorne was when no one was officially watching. The letter from Charlotte's lawyer arrived on a Thursday. It was addressed to Benjamin, and he brought it to her without being asked, which told her something. He set it on the writing desk in her sitting room without a word, and stood with his hands behind his back while she read it. It was 3 pages. Dense with legal language and thin with actual substance, the way legal letters often are, when the intention is intimidation rather than argument. Charlotte was formally requesting a review of the children's living situation. She was citing in oblique terms the suddenness of Benjamin's remarriage, the unfamiliarity of the new wife to the children, and her own long-standing concern for their moral and physical welfare. Abigail read it twice. Set it down. "She's not filing yet," she said. "This is a warning." "Or a test," Benjamin said, "to see how I respond." "How did you respond before?" "When she brought the lawyer, I told her to get off my property." Abigail looked at him. "And this time," a pause, "I brought it to you." She picked up the letter again, turned to the second page. "Who drafted this?" "The signature is Winslow's solicitor. But the language in the 3rd paragraph is different. It's sharper. Someone else had a hand in it." Benjamin went still. "She may have brought someone else in from Boston." "Which means she's escalating." Abigail set the letter down. "She wants to rattle you before she moves. Make you react badly so she has something to point at." She looked up at him. "Don't react badly." "I'm not particularly known for patience," he said. And there was something almost dry in it the first time she'd heard anything like that from him. "Then practice it now," she said, "because the next few months are going to require a great deal of it." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, and with a sincerity that she had not expected that caught her without her guard quite in place, "Where did you learn to think like this?" She considered several answers, chose the honest one. Being poor teaches you to think 3 steps ahead, she said. Because you can't afford to react. Reaction costs something you don't have. He absorbed that. And then he sat down, not across from her, not at a formal distance, but in the chair beside the writing desk, the way someone sits when they've decided to stay. And he said, "Tell me what you need me to do." This was the moment Abigail would remember later through everything that followed. Not as a romantic moment. It wasn't that, not yet, not remotely, but as the moment the arrangement became something else. When 2 people who had agreed to a business arrangement found themselves without quite meaning to, on the same side of the same table, fighting the same fight. She told him what she needed. He listened. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. And when she finished, he nodded the way he did when something had been settled. "I'll contact James Alcott tomorrow," he said. "Today," she said, "if you can." He went that afternoon. Meanwhile, Abigail sat down with Mrs. Briggs and had the plainest conversation they'd had yet. "I need you to tell me everything," she said. "Everything Charlotte has said to anyone in this household. Everyone she's spoken to in town. Every letter she's sent that you've seen leave this property. Everything." Mrs. Briggs looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Abigail didn't rush it. "You're not going to let her take them," the older woman said finally. "No," Abigail said. Another pause. And then Mrs. Briggs sat down across from her. Something she had never done before, had never taken the liberty of, and she began to talk. It took most of the afternoon. What emerged was not pretty. Charlotte Winslow had been working this ground for 2 years, slowly and methodically building a case not through overt accusation, but through persistent suggestion. A word here to the deacon, a letter there to the county magistrate, a comment to the dressmaker that the Hawthorne children looked pale, that the house had an air of neglect, that a man who spent his days in business affairs was not equipped to raise a daughter. None of it was provable as malicious. All of it was cumulative. "She's clever," Abigail said. "She's had practice," Mrs. Briggs said, and there was a bitterness in it that Abigail didn't push on. "Did she treat Catherine this way? Her own daughter?" Mrs. Briggs was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Catherine married Benjamin against her mother's wishes. Charlotte wanted her to marry a Boston man, someone with a name she knew. A pause. She never really forgave either of them for it. Abigail let that sit. "But she wants the children now," she said. "She wants the money," Mrs. Briggs said flatly. "She wants the Winslow Trust back under Winslow control. The children are just the means." She looked at Abigail steadily. "But that doesn't mean she isn't dangerous. A woman who uses her own grandchildren as pieces in a financial game, that's a particular kind of dangerous." "Yes," Abigail agreed. "It is." She returned to her writing desk that evening and drafted 3 documents. The first was a detailed household log expenses, schedules, records of the children's lessons and meals and activities, the names of the physician who saw Thomas in the spring for a minor cough and declared him fit, the dates of Emily's music instruction. Orderly, thorough, the kind of record that made disorder impossible to allege. The second was a letter composed carefully and with deliberate mildness to Reverend Alcott, not his lawyer brother, but the Reverend himself, expressing her pleasure at having joined the Harwick congregation and her hope that Emily and Thomas might participate in the church's youth gatherings in the coming weeks. The third was a list of names she intended to visit. Starting with Widow Marsh, she sealed the letter to the Reverend, set the list beside it, and was reaching for the log to add that evening's notes when she heard something in the hall. She opened her door. Benjamin was standing there, not with a blanket this time, but with a lamp he'd clearly been coming down from his study, and he stopped when he saw her. "Still working," he said. "Still working," she agreed. He glanced at the papers visible through the open door. The log, the sealed letter, the list. "You don't stop," he said. And it wasn't a criticism. It was almost something quieter than that. "I can't afford to," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight, and she looked back at him, and it was a very ordinary moment. Two people in a hallway tired with too much to do, except that it wasn't ordinary at all, because she saw something shift in his expression. Not toward her exactly, but toward something, some revision he was making. Some picture he was editing in a way he hadn't expected to need to edit. "James Alcott will meet with us on Saturday," he said. "He's reviewed the trust documents before. He'll know if Charlotte has grounds." "Good." She leaned in the doorway. "And the magistrate? Alcott will reach out directly. He knows the man." He paused. "We may have to make a formal statement about the state of the household, the children's welfare. I'll have the log ready." He looked at the log again, then back at her. "You started it when—" "The day I found the lamp oil discrepancy," she said, 11 days ago." He was quiet for a moment. "You already knew," he said. "Before I told you about Charlotte, you already understood what might be needed." She hadn't known exactly, but she'd felt the shape of something coming. She always did. It was the reflex of a person who'd spent too long in precarious situations, who'd learned to build shelter before the rain started. "I'm a practical woman," she said. He almost said something. She could see it the way a sentence forms and then doesn't. He closed it down in the same controlled way he closed down most things, and nodded and said goodnight and took his lamp and went down the hall. She stood in her doorway for a moment after he'd gone. She was not thinking about him in any particular way. She was thinking about Charlotte Winslow and the shape of the battle ahead. She was thinking about Thomas's fever and Emily's stopped music lessons and the 3 families in the congregation who were watching to see which way the wind blew. But somewhere underneath the strategy, underneath the practical and the measured and the carefully constructed, she was also noting with the peripheral awareness of a woman who has learned not to trust peripheral awareness too quickly, that Benjamin Hawthorne standing in a hallway with a lamp was a different man than Benjamin Hawthorne signing a marriage register. And she didn't know quite what to do with that observation yet, so she put it away, labeled it information not yet applicable, and went back to her writing desk. The meeting with James Alcott on Saturday went well, and also didn't go well, which was roughly what Abigail had expected. The well part. Alcott confirmed that Charlotte's position was weaker than she was performing it to be. The trust was structured in Benjamin's favor as the father and legal guardian. Charlotte had no direct standing under current Massachusetts law to claim custody against a living father's wishes, unless she could demonstrate clear negligence or moral failing. The not well part, demonstrating moral failing, didn't require a high bar, and Charlotte apparently knew it. Alcott had already heard through his brother, the Reverend through the same network Charlotte had been working, that she was now suggesting Benjamin's hasty remarriage was evidence of instability. That installing a woman of no family and no standing into the role of stepmother showed poor judgment in matters of the children's welfare. "She's not going to claim you're a bad father," Alcott said to Benjamin. He was a careful man, precise and spare in his speech. "She's going to claim you made a bad decision, and then she's going to point at that decision." A brief glance toward Abigail, not unkind, and ask the court to consider whether the children's guardian is capable of sound judgment. Benjamin's jaw tightened. "What do we need?" Abigail asked. Alcott looked at her with the particular expression of a lawyer being addressed by a woman in a professional capacity, a kind of recalibration, a reassessment of who was actually driving this conversation. "Time," he said. "Stability. Evidence that the household is functioning well and the children are thriving. The longer this marriage holds without incident, the weaker Charlotte's argument becomes." Another pause. "And if the children themselves could be seen to be not performing contentment, but genuinely settled, that would matter considerably to a sympathetic magistrate." "Thomas and Emily are settled," Benjamin said. "They're getting there," Abigail said at the same moment, and both men looked at her. "Emily is still grieving. Thomas has days when he's angry at everything and doesn't know why. They're children who lost their mother 8 months ago. Settled is a process, not a condition." Alcott looked at her for a long moment. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, "I suspect you are going to be a considerable asset in this matter." She didn't need to be told that, but she noted it. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The summer deepened, sticky and relentless the way Massachusetts summers got in August, and the house moved into a new rhythm. Not comfortable exactly, not yet. but functional, purposeful. The daily record Abigail kept grew thicker. Emily played the piano on Tuesday and Thursday now, and occasionally on Sunday afternoons when she thought no one was listening. Thomas's Latin improved to the point where his tutor, Mr. Foster, told Benjamin the boy was genuinely advanced for his age, and Benjamin reported this to Abigail with something she was almost certain was pride. They had dinner together, all four of them, every evening. This had been Abigail's idea, presented to Benjamin not as a household reform, but as a practical question. The children are eating separately most evenings. Is there a reason for that? He'd said no. She'd said then they should all eat together. And somehow that small thing, the four of them around the table, Thomas talking too much and Emily listening acutely, and Benjamin saying little, but present fully, present became the anchor of the house's new shape. She noticed that he started asking the children questions at dinner. Not quizzing them, not performing fatherly interest, genuinely asking. What did Thomas think about the new Latin texts? Did Emily want to eventually perform her music, or just play for herself? Had either of them heard about the flooding down in the South County, and what did they reckon had caused it? Thomas had opinions about everything. Emily's answers were careful, and then gradually less careful. Gradually more willing to be wrong, to wonder out loud, to let herself be curious without bracing for it. Abigail watched this, and understood that the children weren't broken. They'd just been waiting for someone to let them be normal. The second letter from Charlotte's lawyer arrived on a Tuesday. It was shorter than the first, harder. Charlotte was formally requesting a meeting with Benjamin with Abigail, and with the children present at a neutral location with her lawyer in attendance. The implication was clear. This was the step before filing. Benjamin came to Abigail's sitting room with it at 7 in the evening. She read it standing up. "She wants to see if we'll flinch," Abigail said. "She wants to see the children," Benjamin said. His voice was flat. "She'll say that. She'll frame it as a grandmother's right. And the lawyer being present is not a coincidence." Abigail set the letter on the desk. She turned to face him. "We need to agree on something, you and I, before we respond to this." He waited. "The children need to know what's happening," she said. "Not the legal details, not the money, but they're old enough to understand that someone is trying to remove them from their home. And if they're going to be put in a room with Charlotte Winslow and her lawyer, they deserve to go into that room prepared." Something crossed Benjamin's face, a flash of something sharp, and then quickly contained. "Emily is 12. 12-year-olds have survived considerably more than an awkward meeting," Abigail said quietly. "And Emily is not a fragile child. She's a careful one. There's a difference." She paused. "Thomas will be angry. He should be angry. He should know why." Benjamin walked to the window, stood with his back to her for a long moment. "I've been trying to protect them from this," he said. "I know." Her voice was gentle. "But you can't protect them from something that's already in their house. You can only prepare them for it." He turned back. His face was doing something complicated that he had imperfectly this time tried to shut down before she saw it. But she saw it. "I don't know how to tell them," he said. And this was the moment she understood that underneath the composure and the deliberate distance and the careful, controlled management of everything he felt, Benjamin Hawthorne was genuinely frightened. Not of Charlotte. Not of the legal process. Of failing them. Of looking at his children and saying, "Someone wants to take you from me, and I have to ask you to be brave about it." She crossed the room and stood beside him. "You say it the way you say everything important," she said. Simply. Without decoration. He looked at her. Very close now, closer than they'd stood before. She could see the lines around his eyes, deeper than she'd first noticed, the kind that came from years of keeping the jaw tightened. From years of refusing to let things through. "You're not afraid," he said. "I'm afraid of a great many things," she said. "I'm just not afraid of this particular one." He held her gaze for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he stepped back deliberately, she thought not unconsciously, and he said, "We'll tell them tonight, at dinner." She nodded. "Together," he added, "if you're willing." "I'm willing," she said. That night at the table with Thomas, still working through his second helping of bread, and Emily finishing her cider, Benjamin set down his fork and said, "There's something I need to tell you both. Thomas looked up instantly. Emily became very still, and Benjamin told them. Plainly. Without decoration, just as Abigail had said. He told them that their grandmother was worried about them, and that her worry had taken a shape that required the family to be prepared. He told them they might have to meet with her and speak to some official people. He told them they didn't have to be afraid, and he told them. And this was the part Abigail had not expected, the part that hit her somewhere. She didn't have a guard up for that. He was sorry he hadn't told them sooner. Thomas was quiet for 3 full seconds, which was unprecedented. Then he said, "Is she going to take us away?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Benjamin said. Thomas nodded, picked up his bread. "All right," he said. "Then I'm not worried." Emily looked at her father for a long moment. Then she looked at Abigail. And she said quietly, with the careful precision of a girl who chose her words like she chose her footsteps, "You're going to fight for us, aren't you?" Abigail held her gaze. "Yes," she said. "We are." Emily nodded, turned back to her plate. And after a moment she reached across the table and poured more cider into her father's glass. Just quietly, just gently, the way you do for someone you love, and said nothing more about it. But Abigail saw Benjamin's hand still on the table for just a moment when Emily did it. She saw his throat move. And she looked down at her own plate, because some things deserve their privacy. The meeting with Charlotte was set for the following Saturday. James Alcott prepared them. Abigail prepared the children in her own way, not by rehearsing answers, but by asking Thomas and Emily to simply be themselves. To answer questions honestly and say, "I don't know," if they didn't know, and not worry about performing anything. Thomas said he could do that easily because he always told the truth. Emily said she'd try. The night before the meeting, Abigail couldn't sleep. She sat at her writing desk in the dark and went through everything she'd built in the past 6 weeks. The logs, the records, the letters, the names of the people she'd spoken to, and the things they'd said. The small mountain of documentation that said, "This house is whole. These children are safe. This family is real." She heard footsteps in the hall. They stopped. A knock. Once. Quiet. She opened the door. Benjamin stood there without a lamp. This time just in the dark of the hallway, and he looked for the first time since she'd come to this house, tired in a way he hadn't tried to hide. "You're not sleeping," he said. "Neither are you," she pointed out. He leaned against the doorframe. "I keep thinking about things I should have done differently. Should have taken Charlotte's early letters more seriously. Should have built a stronger legal position before—" He stopped. "Before marrying a woman with no family and no name," she finished. He held her gaze. "That's not what I meant." "I know." She leaned against the other side of the doorframe. "But it's what Charlotte will mean, so we should be clear-eyed about it." He was quiet for a moment. The house breathed around them. Somewhere down the hall, Thomas muttered something in his sleep, a habit his father apparently shared, if the crease between Benjamin's brows when he heard it was any indication. "What does clear-eyed tell you?" Benjamin asked. "About tomorrow." She thought about it honestly. "Charlotte is going into that room believing she's already won," Abigail said. "She's spent 2 years building her case, and she thinks she's just finished the final piece by getting us to agree to a meeting. She expects you to be defensive and me to be frightened." She paused. "So we won't be either of those things. And the children, Emily will be exactly what she is, serious and perceptive, and impossible to condescend to, without it being obvious. Thomas will be himself, which means Charlotte's lawyer is going to spend half the meeting trying to get a word in edgewise." She almost smiled. "They're going to be fine." He looked at her. "And you?" She met his eyes. "I've been poor and I've been alone, and I've been in rooms where people wanted to dismiss me from the moment I walked in. I know how to stand in a room like that." She lifted her chin slightly. "I know how to make them look at me." Something moved through his expression. Something quick and genuine. Something she thought he hadn't quite intended to let through. "I believe you," he said. They stood there in the doorway a moment longer. Just 2 people tired holding the night between them. Then he straightened. "You should sleep." "So should you," she said. He almost said something else. She could see it again, the forming and the stopping, the same careful machinery. He closed it down, nodded once, and then, just before he turned, he said very quietly, "I'm glad you're here, Abigail." He was already walking away before she could answer. She stood in the doorway and listened to his footsteps go down the hall, and she pressed her palm flat against the doorframe, and she thought about practical decisions and contractual arrangements and the specific danger of learning to rely on something you hadn't expected to need. Then she went inside and closed the door. She needed to sleep. Tomorrow they were going to go into that room and hold this family together, and she was not going to flinch. Saturday came in hard and bright, the kind of summer morning that felt like a dare. Abigail was dressed before 6. Not elaborately, she had no elaborate clothes, but carefully. The gray dress with the white collar, her hair pinned cleanly. The same small pearl earrings she'd worn at the wedding, the only jewelry she owned that had belonged to her mother. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and made a decision she would look exactly like what she was. A woman of modest means, good sense, and complete composure. She would not apologize for what she had, and she would not pretend to what she didn't. She heard Thomas moving around in his room across the hall, which meant he'd been awake for a while. She knocked on his door. "Come in," he said, and she found him standing at his window in his Sunday shirt, which he'd put on correctly but forgotten to tuck, staring down at the yard with his arms crossed over his chest. "Nervous?" she asked. "No," he said, instantly, which meant yes. She went to him and tucked in his shirt without ceremony. He submitted to it without protest, which was its own kind of admission. "Thomas," she said, "I need you to do one thing today, and one thing only." He looked up at her. "What?" "Be exactly yourself, not more, not less." He chewed his lip. "Even if she says something I don't like. Especially then." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have to fight today. Your father and I will handle that. You just have to be Thomas Hawthorne, which is already more than enough." He considered this. Then he stood up, straighter shoulders going back, and there it was, the same gesture she'd seen in his father, the same interior assembling. "All right," he said. She found Emily already downstairs, seated at the breakfast table with a cup of tea. She hadn't touched her hands wrapped around it. Abigail sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. "She's going to ask me questions," Emily said. "Not a question." "Probably." "She'll want me to say I'm unhappy here." "Probably that too." Emily looked at her. "What if I tell her the truth?" "What is the truth?" Abigail asked. Emily was quiet for a moment, looking into her tea. Then she said, "That I miss my mother every single day, and I'll never stop missing her. But that this house feels like it's breathing again." She paused. "Is that all right to say?" Something in Abigail's chest went very still. "That," she said softly, "is the most important thing you could say." Benjamin came downstairs at 7:30. He was dressed well, not formally, not performatively, but with the understated precision of a man who had decided to take this seriously without letting it show that it frightened him. He looked at his children at the breakfast table, then at Abigail, and she gave him the smallest nod. "They're ready." He let out a breath, quiet, controlled, and sat down. They ate breakfast together, all 4 of them, and Abigail thought, whatever happens in that meeting room today, this was real. This table, these people, this ordinary Saturday morning. No one could argue that away. James Alcott met them in front of the town hall at 9 o'clock. He was carrying a document case and wearing the expression of a man who had done his homework and felt reasonably confident about it, which reassured Abigail more than any amount of visible confidence would have. "Charlotte is already inside," he said quietly to Benjamin. "She brought Marcus Hale from Boston. He's a serious advocate, but he prefers intimidation to argument, which means we have the stronger position if we keep our heads." "We'll keep our heads," Abigail said. Alcott looked at her. "I'd like you to speak as little as possible in there, Mrs. Hawthorne. With respect, Charlotte will use anything you say." "She'll try," Abigail agreed, "but I won't be silent if the children need me to speak." Alcott absorbed this. "Fair enough." He opened the door. Charlotte Winslow was seated at the far end of the long table when they walked in. Her lawyer, Marcus Hale, A tall man with a Boston accent already visible in his posture stood behind her. Charlotte herself was dressed in deep burgundy, her silver hair immaculate, her expression arranged into something that managed with considerable skill to look both welcoming and mournful at the same time. "Benjamin," she said. Then her gaze moved to the children. "Thomas, Emily." Her voice softened. "Look at you both." Thomas stood his ground. Emily said, "Good morning, grandmother," in a voice that was polite and gave nothing. Charlotte's eyes moved to Abigail. She let them. "Mrs. Hawthorne," Charlotte said, the same two words as the sitting room, but this time there was a whole architecture behind them. "Mrs. Winslow," Abigail answered, calm, level. Her hands were still. They sat. Alcott and Hale exchanged the particular brief nods of lawyers, acknowledging each other's existence. Hale opened his own document case with the careful deliberation of a man signaling that he had things to show. Charlotte spoke first. She talked about Catherine. Of course she did. It was the strongest card she held, and she played it immediately. Speaking of her daughter with a grief that was entirely genuine and therefore very effective. She talked about the children they'd left behind. She talked about her desire to maintain her connection to her grandchildren, to be a presence in their lives, to honor Catherine's memory by ensuring they were raised with the values Catherine had held dear. It was well done. Abigail had to admit that. The grief was real, which made it impossible to dismiss, and Charlotte wielded it with the practiced ease of a woman who understood that emotional truth can be weaponized without being dishonored. Then Hale leaned forward. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, "your remarriage conducted less than 8 months after your wife's passing. Would you characterize that as a decision made from a position of stability?" Benjamin looked at him. "I'd characterize it as a decision made from a position of necessity," he said. "My children needed a household that functioned. I made the arrangement that best served them. And Mrs. Hawthorne's qualifications to manage a household and oversee the welfare of 2 children are considerable," Benjamin said flatly. "She was a governess for 3 years. She came with recommendations from the Hammond and Prescott families. My children are thriving. Your son had a serious illness last winter," Hale said. "Fever of 6 weeks' duration." "Before Mrs. Hawthorne arrived," Alcott said, "and the attending physician's report shows full recovery by April." Hale shifted. "Your daughter's music instruction was discontinued." "Temporarily," Abigail said. Both Hale and Charlotte looked at her. She continued, voice even. "Emily suspended her own lessons while grieving her mother. They resumed in July under my encouragement. She plays every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday." Hale made a note. Charlotte's gaze didn't leave Abigail's face. "The children were not present for the ceremony," Hale said. "That was my decision," Benjamin said. "I didn't want them to feel obligated to celebrate something they hadn't had time to understand. We have made the introduction gradually, as anyone concerned with their welfare would." Charlotte leaned forward, and here it was, the real move, the one Abigail had been waiting for. "Emily," she said. Her voice dropped, went warm, went grandmotherly. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you say, I love you very much and nothing will change that." A pause perfectly timed. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" The room was very quiet. Emily sat up straight. She looked at her grandmother without flinching, and she said clearly in the steady voice of a girl who had chosen her words before she came into this room, "I miss my mother every day, and I'll never stop missing her." Charlotte's expression moved towards sorrow. Hale started to write. "But this house," Emily continued, "feels like it's breathing again, and I think that's because of Abigail." The pen stopped. Charlotte went very still. Thomas, who had been sitting with his arms crossed and his expression controlled for almost 45 minutes, which was by any measure an extraordinary achievement, said, "I want to stay home." 3 words. Perfectly plain. The silence that followed them was complete. Alcott let it sit for exactly the right amount of time. Then he said, "I think we've heard clearly from both children, Mr. Hale, and I'd like to enter into the record." He opened his case and removed Abigail's household log, 12 weeks of daily documentation, every meal and lesson, and physician's visit and music instruction. A record of the Hawthorne household's operations since July. I believe it speaks for itself. Hale took the documents. He looked at the first page, then the second. His expression did something careful and controlled that meant he was recalibrating. Charlotte looked at Abigail, and Abigail looked back at her and did not look away, and did not smile and did not harden. Just held the older woman's gaze with the steady patience of someone who understood that the meeting had just turned. The meeting ended without resolution, which was Alcott told them afterward on the steps outside a victory of its own kind. Charlotte had come expecting either capitulation or defensiveness, and had gotten neither. Hale had expected a household he could characterize as chaotic, and had gotten 12 weeks of documentation. The children had spoken for themselves. "She'll reassess," Alcott said. "This isn't over, but she's going to need a different strategy now." "How long do we have?" Benjamin asked. "A few weeks, probably, before she moves to formal filing if she still means to." He glanced at Abigail. The log was decisive. That was excellent thinking. Abigail said nothing. She was watching Charlotte's carriage pull away down the road, watching it with the particular attention of someone who knows the fight isn't finished, just rearranged. Benjamin put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Just once, just lightly, the way you touch someone when you mean to say something you don't have words for yet. Then he took the children toward the carriage, and Abigail followed, and they drove home through the August heat, without speaking much. But Thomas fell asleep against the carriage window before they were halfway home, and Emily leaned her head back and closed her eyes, and Benjamin looked across at Abigail, and something passed between them. Not words, not anything that could be named precisely, but the particular quiet acknowledgement of two people who have just stood in a hard place together and found that they could stand. She looked out the window. He looked out his. The elms went past in the afternoon heat. 4 days later, Thomas woke up with a fever. It was Mrs. Briggs who came to Abigail's door at 4:45 in the morning, and the look on the older woman's face told Abigail everything before she said a word. "How high?" Abigail asked, already moving. "High enough. He's asking for his father." She sent for Dr. Marsh before she even reached Thomas's room. By the time she got to him, he was sitting up in bed, flushed and irritable, and clearly trying not to look frightened, which on an 8-year-old face looks very much like fury. "I'm not sick," he said. "You have a fever," she said. She felt his forehead with the back of her hand. Hot. Not dangerously so yet, but going in the wrong direction. "I'm fine. Thomas." She sat on the edge of his bed. "It's all right to be sick. It's not a failure." Something in his face crumpled just slightly. "Last time they didn't know if I was going to—" He stopped. "Father didn't sleep for 2 weeks." She looked at him steadily. "I know. And I'm going to tell you what I know to be true. We caught this early, and we're going to take care of you, and your father is going to be here in about 3 minutes because Mrs. Briggs is already telling him." Right on cue, she heard footsteps in the hall. Quick, not running, but with the controlled urgency of a man keeping himself from running, and Benjamin came through the door. He went straight to Thomas, sat down on the other side of the bed, put his hand on his son's forehead, his cheek, the back of his neck, the automatic inventory of a father who has done this before and been terrified by it before. "It's not as high as last time," Abigail said. "Dr. Marsh is on his way." Benjamin looked at his son's face for a long moment. Thomas looked back at him, and then with the absolute unguarded honesty of a child who is sick and scared and trying not to be. Thomas said, "I don't want it to be like last time, Papa." Benjamin's throat moved. "It won't be," he said. "I promise." He didn't look away from Thomas, but his hand, the one that wasn't pressed to his son's forehead, moved slightly on the coverlet, and Abigail's hand was already there just beside it, and his fingers closed once briefly over hers before he caught himself and let go. She didn't react. She didn't make anything of it. She simply stayed where she was and made sure Thomas drank the water she'd brought. Dr. Marsh arrived at 5:30. He was a gray-haired, unhurried man with the particular competence of someone who had been called to bedsides at all hours for 40 years and found the work no less important for its repetition. He examined Thomas thoroughly and reported that this was not his word comparable to the winter episode. The lungs were clear. The fever was real, but not alarming. Rest, he said. Fluids. Cool compresses if it climbs. I'll return this evening. Benjamin walked him out. When he came back, Abigail was already at the washstand wringing out a cloth. The windows, she said to Mrs. Briggs, who was hovering in the doorway. Open them, and I'll need more water cold as you can get it. Mrs. Briggs moved without comment or hesitation, which Abigail noted in a distant part of her mind would have been unthinkable 6 weeks ago. She pressed the cloth to Thomas's forehead. He scrunched his face. That's cold, he complained. That's the point, she said. It's horrible. Yes, close your eyes. He closed them. After a moment, some of the tension went out of his small shoulders. Abigail, he said without opening his eyes. Yes. I'm glad you didn't leave. She kept her hand steady on his forehead. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He didn't answer, because he was already drifting the fever, pulling him down toward restless sleep. She stayed. She replaced the compress when it lost its coolness. She read to him when he surfaced enough to want it from a natural history book he favored, because it had detailed drawings of birds. Benjamin sat in the chair by the window through most of the morning. He didn't hover. He understood that hovering didn't help, but he didn't leave either. He had papers he'd brought up from his study, and he looked at them occasionally and processed very little because his eyes kept going back to Thomas. At around 10, Emily appeared in the doorway, still in her morning dress, her hair half pinned in a way that suggested she'd heard something and come before she'd finished. How bad? She asked quietly. Not bad, Abigail said. He'll be all right. Emily came in and sat on the end of her brother's bed with the careful lightness of someone who doesn't want to wake him, and she opened the book she'd brought, the Latin grammar of all things, because it was the one Thomas had been complaining about all week, and she began very quietly to read it aloud. She was reading Latin grammar to her sleeping, feverish brother. Abigail looked at Benjamin. He was looking at his daughter with an expression that had slipped entirely past his guard. The raw, uncontrolled look of a man seeing something so unexpectedly tender that he hadn't had time to brace for it. He caught Abigail's eye. And this time, he didn't look away immediately. This time, he let her see it just for a moment. Just briefly, the something that was living underneath all of his careful management. Then he looked back down at his papers. She looked back at Thomas. The fever broke late that night. Abigail knew it the moment she felt his forehead at midnight, the temperature dropping, his breathing slowing from the shallow, effortful rhythm of fever into something easier, more natural. She sat back in her chair and released a breath she hadn't been aware of holding for the last 18 hours. Thomas opened one eye. Is it done? He asked, his voice scratchy with sleep. It's done, she said. He closed the eye again. Good, he said. The compress was awful. She smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled in approximately 19 hours, and it felt like something unclenching. She stood and stretched her back and went to the door and found Benjamin asleep in the chair in the hallway outside Thomas's room, his head dropped forward, his papers still in his lap. He'd positioned himself, she realized, so that he'd wake up if the door opened. He had been sleeping outside his son's sick room all night. She stood there for a moment looking at him. At the lines of his face gone slack with exhaustion, the way the careful control lifted when a person slept. He looked without his composure, like a man who had been carrying a great deal for a very long time. She considered waking him. Decided against it. Found the blanket she'd left at the top of the stairs earlier in the evening and draped it over his shoulders and went back to the chair beside Thomas's bed. She heard him wake an hour later from the way he shifted. Heard him stand. Heard his footsteps stop just outside the door. Then they moved away, and she heard his bedroom door open and close, and she thought some things deserve their privacy. In the morning, Thomas ate porridge and declared it better than usual, which Abigail knew was his way of saying thank you. Emily played the piano for an hour in the afternoon, loud enough to reach the sick room if the door was open, which Abigail made sure it was. Benjamin came to find Abigail in her sitting room that evening. He stood in the doorway. Rather than coming in, there was still that careful maintenance of boundary, that deliberate respect for the lines of the arrangement. You were with him all night, he said, most of it. You need to sleep. I slept in the chair for a few hours. She set down her pen. He's going to be fine. Yes. He paused. A long pause, the kind she was starting to recognize as the prelude to something he was working up to. The blanket was from you, he said. In the hallway. She didn't answer. He leaned against the doorframe. You could have woken me. I'd have been more comfortable in my own room. You'd have been farther from Thomas, she said. That wasn't going to help either of you. Something crossed his face. He didn't look away. Abigail. Benjamin. I don't... He stopped. Started differently. I'm not sure I've said it adequately. What you've done for this family. What you're doing. He looked at her directly, and it was the look from the hallway, the lamplight look, but plainer now, less guarded. I chose this arrangement because it was practical, because I needed something functional, and He stopped again. I didn't expect you. She held his gaze. What does that mean? I don't know yet, he said honestly. She held the honesty of that, the weight of it, the particular difficulty of a man who has decided not to feel things telling you he's not sure his decision is holding. Then I'd suggest, she said carefully, that we don't name it yet, whatever it is. He nodded slowly. That seems wise. Give Thomas another week before he's back at his Latin, she said, returning to her pen. He'll fight you on it but a week. A week, he agreed. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he said, Good night, Abigail. Good night, Benjamin. He left. She sat still for a long moment before she picked up her pen. The letter from Charlotte arrived 3 days later. Not from Hale. From Charlotte herself in her own hand, which was different and more dangerous in ways Abigail felt before she understood. It was addressed to Benjamin. He brought it to her without opening it, which was also different, which meant something she filed away, and she opened it and read it. Charlotte had heard about Thomas's illness. She had heard about it from Widow Marsh, the same Widow Marsh who was one of Charlotte's 3, who had apparently called on the house with a loaf of bread during the fever and been turned away by Mrs. Briggs at the door because the house was not receiving visitors. Charlotte had taken this in the letter as evidence. The letter was quiet and grievous, and absolutely lethal in tone. It expressed her pain at hearing that her grandson had been ill, and she had not been informed. It expressed her concern that a household still finding its footing might not be adequately equipped for a medical emergency of this nature. It expressed in language Hale had clearly helped refine her intention to petition the Middlesex County Court for a formal welfare assessment of the children to take place within 30 days. 30 days. Abigail set the letter down. She pressed her palm flat on the desk and breathed. How bad? Benjamin said from across the room. He'd seen her face. She's filing, Abigail said. 30 days. She looked up. She used Thomas's fever. She's saying we should have informed her, that we withheld information about the children's health. Benjamin went very still. That's what we have 30 days to disprove. She was already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. I need Dr. Marsh's report, the written one with dates and findings. I need the log. I need a statement from Mrs. Briggs about the door, what she said, why, and when. She was writing as she spoke, the list forming under her hand. And I need James Alcott before the end of this week. I'll send for him today. Today? Yes. She stopped writing, looked at the letter again. The 30 days. The words, welfare assessment. She timed it, Abigail said. She was already planning this. She heard about the fever, and she moved the timeline forward because she thought it gave her something. Did it? She thought about it honestly. It gives her the appearance of something, a sick child, a door that turned her away. If we can't produce documentation showing proper care and a physician's full accounting, she can make it look like the household was managing a crisis badly. We weren't. I know that. You know that. Dr. Marsh knows that. She looked at him. The magistrate doesn't know it yet. Benjamin sat down. This was the first time she'd seen him sit down in response to something he had the reflex usually to receive bad news, standing as if posture were armor. But he sat, and he put his elbows on his knees, and he looked at the floor for a moment. She'll put someone in this house, he said. An assessor. Someone to look at the children, the rooms, the way we live, to interview the servants. Yes. To interview Emily and Thomas again. Yes. She kept her voice even. Which is why we need to make sure that when someone comes into this house looking for a reason to remove those children, they find absolutely nothing. She paused. And there is nothing to find. The difference is that we need it to be documented, witnessed, and impossible to argue with. He looked up at her. And she saw something in his face she hadn't seen before. Not fear exactly, and not helplessness, but the particular humbling expression of a man who has been self-sufficient for so long that needing help feels like losing a piece of himself. I need you, he said. Just that. Plain. Not as a practical matter. I mean, I need your mind in this, your way of thinking. I need you to tell me what you see because I'll miss things. I always have. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. He looked up sharply like he'd expected her to deny it. I've known that since the lamp oil discrepancy, she said. You're not a man who sees the details. You see the large things, the shape of problems, but you miss the small ones. She said it without judgment. That's why you needed me. He was quiet for a moment. Is that the only reason? She held his gaze. We said we wouldn't name it yet. He was the first to look away. Right, he said. They sent for Alcott. He arrived the following morning, reviewed the letter, and his expression told Abigail everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking it. Hale has gotten her into Middlesex County Court, he said. That's a problem. The presiding judge there is not unsympathetic to family stability arguments. He's ruled in favor of maternal relatives in 2 recent cases. Maternal relatives who were the primary caregivers, Benjamin said. Yes, but Charlotte will argue she's been a consistent presence in the children's lives, and that the sudden change in household structure, the new wife, the rushed remarriage. It wasn't rushed, Benjamin said. No, but from the outside. Then we show them the inside, Abigail said. Both men looked at her. We open the house, we open the records. We don't wait for an assessor to come and look, we invite one, before the hearing, before Charlotte can control the framing. She looked at Alcott. Can we request that the welfare assessment take place here rather than in a courtroom? Alcott considered this. That's an unusual request. It's a confident one, she said, which is exactly what we need to project. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Benjamin. Benjamin said, She's right. If we wait for them to come to us on their terms, we're already defending. If we invite them in, we're the ones who have nothing to hide. It's a risk, Alcott said. If anything in that house is out of order on the day, nothing will be out of order, Abigail said. She said it quietly, without performance, just absolute earned certainty. And she saw Alcott make a decision. She could see the exact moment he decided she was not simply Benjamin's wife managing a household crisis, but a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. Very well, he said. I'll make the request. That night, Abigail sat with Mrs. Briggs in the kitchen long after the household had gone to sleep. She used the door, Abigail said. Widow Marsh being turned away. We need your statement to be very clear about why. I turned her away because we had a sick child and a house full of people trying to care for him, Mrs. Briggs said. Widow Marsh wanted to gossip. Any sensible person would have turned her away. Write that down, Abigail said. Exactly as you said it. I'll bring you paper. She brought the paper. She sat at the table while Mrs. Briggs wrote, and when the older woman had finished, she read it carefully and found it entirely sufficient. Clear, plain, unmistakably the voice of a woman who had run this household for 20 years and was not in the habit of tolerating foolishness. Mrs. Briggs, Abigail said, setting down the statement, I need to ask you something. Ask. The servants. All of them, the kitchen girl, John the groundskeeper, the stable hand. When the assessor comes, each of them is going to be asked whether this is a well-run household, whether the children are cared for, whether there is anything that has concerned them. She looked at the older woman steadily. I can't tell you what to say. I wouldn't. But I need to know if there is anything at all that would concern you if you were answering those questions. Mrs. Briggs sat with that for a moment. No, she said. Then, with the particular weight of someone adding something they've decided to add, this house has more warmth in it now than it's had since before Mrs. Catherine got ill. She paused. That's what I'll say if they ask, because it's true. Abigail looked at her. Thank you. Don't thank me, Mrs. Briggs said. She picked up her tea. Just win. The assessor came on the Thursday. His name was Mr. Willard, and he was a compact, careful man from the county court, and he arrived with a notebook and an expression so professionally neutral it was its own kind of declaration. He spent 4 hours in the house. He reviewed Abigail's logs. He spoke to Mrs. Briggs, to Mr. Foster, the tutor to the stable hand, John to the kitchen girl. Patience. He ate a slice of pound cake that Abigail had made specifically for this purpose, not to impress him, but because having food on offer was a normal, functional, welcoming household thing to do, and she was letting the house speak for itself. He spoke with Emily for 20 minutes, with Thomas for 30. Thomas had opinions about the assessment process, which he delivered at some length, and which Willard recorded with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was a close neighbor to one. He asked Abigail 3 questions directly. How long had she been in the household, what her specific responsibilities were, and whether she considered herself to be the children's primary caregiver. I consider myself their stepmother, she said, which includes everything. And your relationship with Mr. Hawthorne? She looked at him steadily. We have a great deal of respect for each other. We are working together to give this family what it needs. A pause. I believe that's what a marriage is. He made a note. Benjamin was present for most of it, not hovering, but available in the way of a man who is comfortable in his own house and has nothing to be ashamed of. He answered Willard's questions about the trust, about Catherine's estate, about Charlotte's previous legal efforts, with a directness that Willard noted without reaction, but noted nonetheless. At the end of 4 hours, Willard stood, collected his notebook, and shook Benjamin's hand. I'll submit my report within 2 weeks, he said, prior to the hearing. When the door closed behind him, Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs and said, Did we pass? We'll know in 2 weeks, Abigail said. I told him about the bird's nest in the East Oak, Thomas said. The one with the fledglings. Do you think that helped? Emily appeared behind him. How would birds help Thomas? It shows I'm observant, Thomas said with dignity. That's important. Abigail pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth. Not quick enough, Benjamin beside her saw the almost smile, and the corner of his own mouth moved in response. Come down for supper, he said to the children. They came. The 2 weeks felt like a month. Abigail kept working the log, the household, the steady daily architecture of a life that was functioning. She spent more time with Emily, who was quieter than usual in these weeks, absorbing something that a 12-year-old shouldn't have had to absorb. She read to her. She let her play the piano without comment or request. She taught her at Emily's own request how to keep a household account, not as a chore, but as a kind of power. You'll want to understand money, Abigail told her. It keeps you from needing things you can't ask for. Emily learned the accounts quickly. Of course she did. Willard's report arrived on a Friday morning. Benjamin brought it to her. She recognized the county seal. He held it out. You open it? She looked at him. It's addressed to you. Yes, he said. Open it. She opened it. She read it. The language was formal and careful, and moved slowly, the particular slowness of official prose that has been drafted to be irrefutable, and she read every word before she let herself understand what it said. Mr. Willard had found the Hawthorne household to be in his assessment well-ordered, appropriately maintained, and this word warm. He had found both children to be healthy, engaged, and in the case of Thomas, remarkably forthcoming about his affection for his home and family. He had found the household records to be thorough, beyond what was ordinarily evidenced in comparable assessments. He had found no grounds for concern regarding the children's welfare. He recommended against the formal custody petition on the basis of insufficient evidence of neglect. He was recommending against Charlotte's petition. Abigail set the report down. She pressed both hands flat on the desk. She breathed. Well, Benjamin said. She looked up at him, and she could not entirely keep everything out of her face. Some of it got through. The relief of it, the accumulated weight of weeks, finally lifting the particular exhausted satisfaction of having built something solid and had it hold. "She's not going to win," Abigail said. Benjamin looked at the report, then at her. He crossed the room in 3 steps and picked up the document and read it quickly all the way through, and she watched his face as he did. Something released in him. She saw it happen, the controlled tension that had lived in his jaw and his shoulders, and the set of his eyes since Charlotte's letter arrived. It released just partially, just at the edges. His jaw loosened. His next breath went deeper than the ones before it. He set the report down. He stood there for a moment with his hands on the desk and his head slightly bowed, and she understood that she was watching a man give himself 30 seconds to feel something he'd been holding off for weeks. She gave him those 30 seconds. Then he straightened. He turned. He looked at her with the most open expression she had seen on his face. Not the lamplight look, not the recalibration look, but something that hadn't been named between them yet. Something that was living in the territory they'd agreed not to enter too quickly. "This is because of you," he said. "It's because of all of us," she said. "Abigail, the hearing is still ahead," she said gently. "This is the assessment. Charlotte can still contest it. She'll lose," he said. "She knows it. Knowing it doesn't always stop people." He held her gaze. "No," he said. "It doesn't." She picked up her pen. He didn't move. "Benjamin," she said without looking up. "I know," he said. "I know we said we wouldn't name it. We did say that." A pause. "I'm struggling," he said, to maintain the agreed position. She set down the pen. She looked up at him. She held his gaze for a long moment, long enough that it said something, long enough that she felt something she had no particular defenses against anymore. Because defenses require you to believe you need them. And she had been living in close enough proximity to this man for long enough that some of her certainty about needing them had quietly dissolved. "Give it a little more time," she said. He held her gaze. "How much more time?" "Until after the hearing," she said. "When it's over. When the children are safe and this is finished." He nodded, slowly. It cost him something. She could see that it cost him, but he nodded. "After the hearing," he said. "After the hearing," she agreed. He picked up the report. He looked at it one more time. Then he set it down between them like a bridge and went to tell his children the news. Charlotte Winslow did not withdraw her petition. Alcott delivered this news on a Monday morning, standing in the front hallway with his hat in his hands and an expression that said he had expected this but had hoped otherwise. Benjamin received it without visible reaction, which Abigail had come to understand was not the absence of feeling, but its compression. Everything going inward, everything being managed in that private interior space where he kept the things that mattered most. Willard's report was favorable, Alcott said. She should withdraw. Any reasonable person would. Charlotte Winslow is reasonable, Abigail said from the doorway of her sitting room. She's also determined. Those two things can coexist. Alcott looked at her. She's filed a counter-argument to the assessment. She's claiming Willard was given an incomplete picture, that the household presented a managed appearance rather than an authentic one. She's saying we performed it, Benjamin said. Yes. The hallway was quiet for a moment. Abigail thought about the 4 hours Mr. Willard had spent in the house, Thomas and his bird's nest, Emily, and her piano. Mrs. Briggs's handwritten statement, the pound cake cooling on the kitchen table. She thought about whether any of it had been performance. She decided it hadn't. It had been exactly what they were, which was why Charlotte's argument would ultimately fail. But ultimately was not the same as easily. The hearing is in 3 weeks, Alcott continued. Middlesex County Court, Judge Harold Beecham presiding. He paused on the name in a way that communicated something. Beecham, Benjamin said. You've mentioned his rulings before. He's not hostile to men of property. He is, however, susceptible to the language of moral duty, family legacy, the argument that children belong in a household of established standing. Alcott set his hat on the hall table. Charlotte will use that language. Hale is very good at it. Then we speak it better, Abigail said. Both men looked at her. Not the same words, she clarified. A different kind of standing, not name and money function. Love. Evidence of a household that works because people in it actually care for each other, not because they've inherited the right furniture. She looked at Alcott. What does Beecham respond to, specifically? Alcott thought about it. He has children himself. Grown, but he's spoken publicly about the importance of a mother's presence in a household. He's sentimental about it in the way of a man who's idealized something he values. Then we give him a mother's presence, Abigail said. Not sentiment, evidence. Alcott took a breath. Mrs. Hawthorne, I want to be direct with you about something. Please. Charlotte's counter-argument is not primarily about the household's function. It's about you. He said it carefully. Your lack of family name, your background as a paid servant. She's going to argue in that courtroom that a woman of her word station cannot adequately provide the social and moral foundation that the Winslow grandchildren require. The hallway was very still. Abigail felt the shape of it land. She'd been expecting it. She'd been expecting it since Charlotte walked into her sitting room and said, "My daughter's house." But hearing it formalized, hearing it as a legal argument was a different thing. She's going to make this about who I am, Abigail said. Yes. Rather than what I've done. Yes. She nodded slowly. Then we bring what I've done into that courtroom and we let it answer for me. Alcott was quiet for a moment. Then, the Hammond family. You mentioned them as a reference when you were hired as a governess. I worked for them for 2 years. Would they speak on your behalf? A letter of character, or? I'll write to them today, she said. After Alcott left, Benjamin came to stand in the doorway of her sitting room. She was already at her writing desk, already pulling out paper. Abigail. I'm all right, she said. I know you are. He came in all the way in, not stopping at the threshold, and sat in the chair beside the desk. I want you to know something. Whatever Hale says in that courtroom about who you are, I know who you are. The children know who you are. Nothing Charlotte Winslow says under oath is going to change that. She kept her eyes on the paper. Her throat felt tight in a way she hadn't expected and couldn't quite manage. Thank you, she said. It's not gratitude, he said. It's fact. She pressed her pen to the paper, started the letter to the Hammonds. Her handwriting was even and clear and gave nothing away. He stayed until she'd finished the first paragraph, and then he stood and said he was going to speak to Alcott about witness preparation, and he left. But he left differently than he usually left, not with that deliberate management of distance, but just normally the way you leave a room when you're comfortable in it and will be back. She noticed. She always noticed everything. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the hardest of all the hard weeks since July, not because of the practical work. The practical work she could do in her sleep by now. But because the practical work couldn't entirely fill the space that the waiting occupied. She kept the household. She kept the log. She wrote to the Hammonds and received within the week a letter of character so warm and specific and entirely unambiguous that she read it twice before she let herself believe it was real. Alcott entered it into the record. He also entered the logs. Dr. Marsh's medical report, Mrs. Briggs's statement, Mr. Willard's assessment, and the tutor Mr. Foster's written account of Thomas's academic progress under the current household arrangement. Charlotte's side was building too. Abigail knew it without knowing the specifics, the way you can feel a storm that hasn't broken yet. She knew Charlotte was talking to people. She knew Widow Marsh had given some kind of statement. She knew that the Aldrich family, one of the 3 from the congregation, had been called to speak on Charlotte's behalf about the state of the household before Abigail's arrival. This last one worried her. She'd met Eleanor Aldrich twice at church. The woman had been cool, but not overtly hostile. She hadn't known what to make of it then. Now she thought she understood Eleanor Aldrich was someone who had been told a story before she'd had the chance to observe the facts, and who had organized her opinions around the story, rather than the other way around. There was no correcting that kind of position in 3 weeks. She told Benjamin this plainly. Then we don't try to correct her, he said. We let Alcott handle her on cross. Is Alcott good at cross-examination? He's methodical, Which is better? She accepted this. Emily asked her one evening what would happen if they lost the hearing. Abigail looked at the girl. Emily was sitting at the desk in her room, her Latin grammar open in front of her. She'd started working through it on her own without being asked, and her expression was the one she used when she wanted an honest answer and was bracing for a soft one. If the judge rules in Charlotte's favor, Abigail said carefully, your grandmother would have legal authority to apply for custody. Your father could appeal. Could he win an appeal? Yes, Alcott believes so, but it would take time. Yes. Emily was quiet for a moment. Would we have to go to Boston while it was being appealed? Abigail held the question steady. I don't know, she said. I won't tell you something I'm not sure of. Emily nodded. She looked back at her Latin grammar, then back at Abigail. I've been praying, she said. Is that foolish? No, Abigail said. It's not. I pray that we stay together, all four of us. Abigail looked at her, at the careful, composed 12-year-old face that had, over the past few months, gradually learned to be less careful, to be more freely itself. So do I, Abigail said. And she meant it without qualification. The night before the hearing, Thomas could not sleep. He appeared in the hallway at 9:30, barefoot, wearing his nightshirt, carrying the natural history book with the bird drawings in it, the same one Abigail had read to him during the fever, with the expression of a boy who has tried to sleep and failed and decided not to pretend otherwise. Abigail's light was still on. He knocked. Come in, Thomas, she said, because of course she'd heard him in the hall. He came in, stood in the middle of the room with the book and his bare feet. I can't stop thinking about it, he said. I know. What if he decides wrong the judge? What if he just doesn't see it right? She thought about how to answer this. She had learned with Thomas that simplicity worked better than comfort. He was a boy who could detect condescension at 50 paces and resented it. Then we appeal, she said, and we keep fighting until the answer is right. But what if it takes a long time? Then it takes a long time. He looked at her. His face was doing something complicated that he was trying unsuccessfully to contain. You won't leave, he said, even if it gets harder. She held his gaze. Thomas Hawthorne, she said, I told you once before. I'm not going anywhere. He stood there for another moment. Then he walked over to the chair beside her writing desk. Benjamin's chair, the one he'd taken to sitting in, and he sat down and opened his bird book and said, Will you read just for a bit? She picked up the book. She read to him for 40 minutes about herons and bluebirds and the migratory patterns of the snow goose until his head dropped sideways and his breathing deepened. She set the book down. She looked at him, this boy with his ink-stained thumbs and his furious loyalty and his absolute refusal to be anything other than exactly himself. And she felt with complete clarity that whatever the court decided tomorrow, this was not something she was doing out of obligation. She had not been looking for a family, but she had found one. She woke Benjamin quietly. He was still in his study working on something she suspected was a pretense for not being able to sleep either, and told him Thomas had fallen asleep in her sitting room. He came and gathered his son, who was just conscious enough to mumble something incoherent and curl his arm around his father's neck, and Benjamin carried him down the hall to his own room without a word. When he came back, he stopped at her door. He asked you if you'd leave, Benjamin said. He'd heard. He'd been standing in the doorway. Yes. What did you tell him? The truth, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw it again. The thing that lived underneath everything, the thing neither of them had named, yet pressing against the surface of him like water behind glass. He was holding it back still, but the glass was thinner than it had been. After tomorrow, he said quietly. After tomorrow, she agreed. The Middlesex County Courthouse was a plain, serious building, and the courtroom inside it was exactly what courtrooms were. In 1817, Massachusetts, hard benches, high windows, the smell of wood polish and paper, and the particular tension of rooms where consequential things get decided. Judge Harold Beecham was a broad, gray-haired man in his 60s who took his seat with the unhurried authority of someone who had presided over enough hearings to have stopped being impressed by his own position. Charlotte sat on one side straight-backed, dressed in her deepest gray. Marcus Hale beside her, with his Boston precision and his prepared arguments. Benjamin and Abigail sat on the other side with Alcott between them. Emily and Thomas were in the gallery behind them, with Mrs. Briggs on one side and the kitchen girl Patience on the other, quiet present, a household assembled. Abigail felt Thomas's eyes on the back of her neck the entire time. Hale opened first. He was good, she'd known he would be. He spoke about continuity, about the Winslow family's deep roots in Massachusetts society, about Catherine, whose memory he invoked with genuine skillfulness, not manipulatively, but in the way that made you feel the loss of her, and then subtly made you feel that loss as an argument for Charlotte's position. He spoke about the children's need for stable, established caregiving, for connection to their maternal heritage. He spoke, as Alcott had predicted, about moral foundation, about the kind of home a judge of Beecham's discernment would recognize as appropriate for children of the Winslow name. He spoke about Abigail for approximately 4 minutes, her lack of family, her background in domestic service. He was careful he didn't say anything that could be called outright contempt, but the architecture of the argument was clear. She was not enough. She would never be enough. She sat still through all of it, her hands in her lap, her face even. Benjamin beside her did not move, but she felt the tension in him, the particular stillness of a man exerting significant effort to maintain composure, and once briefly his knee pressed against hers under the table. She didn't move away. Alcott responded with methodology. He entered the documents, the logs, the Hammond letter which he read a portion of aloud, Dr. Marsh's report, Willard's assessment with its word warm sitting in the middle of official language like a living thing. He was precise and unshowy and entirely effective, and Abigail watched Beecham's face while Alcott spoke and saw the judge actually reading the documents as they were entered, not just receiving them. Then Hale called his first witness. Widow Marsh was a small woman who spoke in carefully measured sentences and had clearly rehearsed. She testified that she had been turned away from the house during Thomas's illness, that she had been given no information about his condition, that she had found the new household arrangement to be. She searched for the right word, abrupt. Alcott cross-examined her mildly and effectively. Had she been a regular visitor to the Hawthorne household before the illness? Occasionally. Had she been invited? No, she called without notice. Had she spoken personally to the children in recent months? No. Had she had any direct observation of their welfare? Not directly. No. The witness was dismissed, having said nothing that could hold weight. The Aldrich woman Eleanor was next. She testified that in her observation, the Hawthorne household had seemed unsettled since the remarriage, that she had not seen the children at certain social events she would have expected, that the new mistress of the house seemed, she paused on this, clearly choosing the word, unfamiliar with the family's social obligations. It landed. Abigail watched Beecham's face, and it landed just slightly. Alcott cross-examined. Mrs. Aldrich, have you attended the Harwick congregation in recent Sundays? Yes. And have you observed Mrs. Hawthorne and the children in attendance? A pause. Yes. Were the children appropriately dressed and behaved? Yes. Did you speak with either child directly? Emily greeted me. Would you characterize Emily's manner as that of an unhappy or neglected child? Another pause, longer this time. No, Eleanor Aldrich said, in the tone of someone who has just realized they've been maneuvered into saying the right thing. No, she seemed quite composed. Then Hale called Charlotte. This was the real argument. Charlotte took the stand with the dignified grief of a woman who had spent 2 years rehearsing, and the genuine love of a grandmother who had convinced herself that her interests and her grandchildren's were identical. She spoke about Catherine. She wept once briefly, genuine tears Abigail thought not performed. She spoke about the children as she had known them before, when Catherine was alive, when the house was a different kind of house. She spoke about her fear for them. And then Hale asked her, Mrs. Winslow, in your assessment, is the current household arrangement in the best interests of your grandchildren? Charlotte looked directly at Beecham. My daughter, she said, gave her life to that family. She loved those children with everything she had, and I believe with all my heart that she would want them raised with the dignity and the stability and the name that they deserve. Not in a household assembled from necessity with a woman who has no family, no standing, no connection to anything those children come from. The courtroom was very quiet. Benjamin's hand moved on the table. Abigail put hers over it briefly and pressed. He went still. Alcott stood for cross-examination. He was quiet for a moment. First, the deliberate pause of a man who has something and knows exactly when to use it. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, "you've expressed deep love for your grandchildren today." "I have." "You've spoken about their welfare as your primary concern." "It is." "Then perhaps you can help me understand something." He opened his document case. "The Winslow Family Trust, established by your late husband, for the benefit of Emily and Thomas Hawthorne. Can you describe its terms?" Hale was on his feet. "Objection. The trust documents are not in evidence." "They are now," Alcott said, and produced them. The room shifted. Beecham looked at the documents, then at Alcott. "Proceed." Alcott read the relevant section aloud. His voice was completely flat. "The trust passed to the children at majority Thomas at 21, Emily at 25. Until that time, the managing trustee held authority over the funds. Under the current arrangement, Benjamin was the trustee. Under a guardianship arrangement, the trustee authority would transfer to the appointed guardian." "Mrs. Winslow," Alcott said, "if you were granted custody of Emily and Thomas, you would become the managing trustee of this fund. Is that correct?" Charlotte's lawyer was on his feet again. Charlotte herself had gone very still. "That is the legal consequence, yes," Hale said quickly. "But my client's motivations are not what I asked about," Alcott said. "I asked about the legal consequence." He looked at Beecham. "Your Honor, the Winslow Trust currently contains approximately $42,000 to be managed until the children reach majority. I would ask the court to consider whether Mrs. Winslow's custody petition might be motivated at least in part by the financial authority that would accompany it." The courtroom was no longer quiet in the way it had been. It was quiet in a different way, the way of a room where something has just broken open. Charlotte said with the voice of a woman who has spent 2 years on a plan and just watched it be named in public, "That is an outrageous—" "Mrs. Winslow," Beecham said. "Once. Low." She stopped. Beecham looked at the trust documents for a long moment. He was a sentimental man, Alcott had said. A man who responded to moral language. Abigail watched his face now and saw something shift in it, not immediately, not all at once, but the way a man's face shifts when he's realized that the story he thought he was hearing is not the story that's actually being told. Then Alcott said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call one final witness." Abigail did not expect what happened next. "I'd like to call Emily Hawthorne." She heard Thomas inhale sharply behind her. She turned slightly, just enough, and saw Emily already standing her chin level, her expression the one she wore when she'd decided something and was not going to be moved from it. She had known. Alcott had spoken to her beforehand, and she had known, and she had said yes, and she had not told her father or Abigail, because she'd known they would want to protect her from it. Emily walked to the stand. She was 12 years old, and she looked at this moment about 40. Not in a heartbreaking way, but in the way of a person who has paid for their composure with something real and is choosing to spend it on something that matters. Hale did not object. Abigail thought he'd calculated that objecting to a child's testimony would look worse than letting her speak. Alcott approached her gently. "Emily, you don't have to answer anything that makes you uncomfortable." "I understand," Emily said. Her voice was steady. "Can you tell the court in your own words what your home has been like since July?" Emily looked at the judge. Not at her grandmother, not at her father, not at Abigail. At the judge because she understood that he was the one who needed to hear it. "My mother died in November," she said. "And after that our house was very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. Like a room after a fire. My father was trying to keep everything going, and he was doing it alone, and I could see how hard it was for him, even though he never said so." She paused. "I was trying to take care of Thomas, and Thomas was trying to be brave, and we were all just managing. We were getting through each day, because the alternative was not getting through it. The courtroom was absolutely still. Then Abigail came, Emily said. She didn't try to be my mother. She never pretended my mother didn't exist. She asked about her sometimes not to pry, but because she wanted to know who we were before. Another pause. She taught me to keep accounts because she said understanding money keeps you from needing things you can't ask for. She sat with me in the garden without talking when I didn't want to talk. She stayed with my brother for 18 hours during his fever without sleeping. One of the women in the gallery made a soft sound. Abigail did not look. She makes our house feel like people live there, Emily said. Not like people are surviving there. She stopped, looked at Beecham directly. My grandmother loves us. I know that. But love is not the same as what's best. And what's best is where we are. Alcott said quietly. Thank you, Emily. Emily stood and walked back to the gallery and sat down beside Mrs. Briggs, and Mrs. Briggs did something Abigail had never seen her do. She took Emily's hand and held it. Beecham asked no questions of his own. He looked at his documents for a long moment. Then he looked at Charlotte, who had gone still in the witness stand, with an expression that was grief, and something else, something harder to name, the expression of a woman who has been seen clearly and knows it. Mrs. Winslow, Beecham said, you may step down. She did. Hale attempted a closing argument. He was professional and capable, and it didn't matter because the room had already decided. Alcott's closing was brief. Almost spare 3 minutes of plain language about the household record, about the assessment, about the evidence of a family that functioned because it was built with intention by people who cared about each other. Then he sat down. Beecham called a recess of 30 minutes. The 30 minutes were the longest of Abigail's life. She sat in the hallway outside the courtroom with Thomas on one side and Emily on the other, and Benjamin across from her, and none of them spoke much. Thomas picked at the hem of his jacket. Emily sat perfectly straight. Benjamin looked at his hands. Once he looked up at Abigail, and she looked back at him, and she thought, whatever the next 30 years look like, that look is something I will remember until I can't remember anything. Mrs. Briggs brought water from somewhere. Alcott reviewed his notes. Outside, a cart passed in the street, and someone laughed at something, the ordinary oblivious sounds of a town that didn't know what was being decided inside this building. The clerk came to the door. They went back in. Beecham settled his papers, looked at the room. In the matter of Winslow versus Hawthorne, he said, this court has reviewed the petition for custody assessment and the counter-evidence submitted by the respondent. He paused. Mr. Willard's assessment of the Hawthorne household has been entered into the record. The court finds it thorough and credible. He looked at his papers. The household accounts, the medical records, the letter of character, and the testimony of the minor child Emily Hawthorne have been given full consideration. Another pause. Thomas reached under the table and found Abigail's hand. He held it with both of his. She let him. The court finds no sufficient grounds to override the natural guardianship of Benjamin Hawthorne in the care of his minor children, Beecham said. The petition for custody assessment is denied. Mrs. Winslow's claim is dismissed. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a word. Emily closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Benjamin sat very still, and then he turned to Abigail, and she was already looking at him. And his face, his extraordinary, carefully managed, perpetually composed face, had finally fully let go of the composition. What was underneath it was not one thing. It was not simple. It was the kind of expression that takes years of living to produce relief and grief, and something new and fragile and entirely real, all of it together, none of it hidden. Thank you, he said. Just that. She shook her head. It was us, she said. All of us. He looked at his children, Thomas, with his face pressed briefly against Abigail's arm. Emily sitting very straight with her eyes open now, and bright, and he said nothing more because there wasn't anything that needed to be said. Charlotte stood as they rose to leave. She looked older somehow than she had coming in. She looked at the children for a long moment, and her face did something complicated in private. Emily, she said. Emily looked at her grandmother. You spoke well, Charlotte said. Her voice was stiff with things she wasn't saying. "Your mother would have been—" She stopped, swallowed. "She would have been very proud." Emily nodded. "I know," she said, simply without cruelty, without concession. "I know she would." Charlotte looked at Abigail last. The look was long. Abigail met it and did not fill the silence. "You won," Charlotte said. "The children did," Abigail said. Something shifted in Charlotte's face just slightly, just at the edges. Not concession, not warmth, but something that was perhaps the distant ancestor of both. She turned and left with Hale. Outside on the courthouse steps, the August heat hit like an open hand. Thomas immediately tipped his face up to it, squinting. Emily stood beside her father and put her hand in his without looking at him. He closed his fingers around hers. Alcott shook hands with Benjamin, then with Abigail. He said it was the most effective household documentation he'd entered in 20 years of practice. He said Emily's testimony had turned the room. He said they should all go home and rest. He was right on every count. They walked to the carriage. Thomas climbed in first, then Emily. Benjamin held the door for Abigail, not with the formal distance of the early weeks, but simply naturally with the ease of a man whose habits have quietly rearranged themselves around another person. She climbed in. He followed. The carriage moved. Thomas fell asleep before they'd gone a mile, which was not the behavior of a child who had been under any genuine strain, or possibly was exactly that. Emily was watching the passing fields with the expression of someone letting something go piece by piece into the air. Benjamin said quietly enough that only Abigail could hear, "I spent most of that recess thinking about all the things I should have said to you over the past months. Things I kept managing." She looked at him. "Did you come to any conclusions?" she said. "Several," he said. "Most of them seem inadequate." She looked out the window. The fields were very gold in the late summer light, the particular gold of Massachusetts in August, just before it tips into September. "You don't have to be adequate," she said. "You just have to be honest." He was quiet for a moment. "I am afraid," he said, "of wanting something I'm not sure I deserve." She turned back to look at him. "What would make you deserving of it?" He had no immediate answer. "Nothing Charlotte said today was wrong," he said slowly. "About the arrangement, about the speed of it, about what I needed and why I made the choice I made." He looked at her. "I married you because I was practical, and you deserve better than that as a beginning." She considered him carefully. The line of his face, the particular quality of his honesty. It was not easy honesty, the kind that comes without cost. It was the kind that came from somewhere deep and private and required something of the person speaking it. "Every worthwhile thing I've ever had in my life started as something practical," she said. "My first tutoring position, the room I rented on Clement Street, the decision to answer your advertisement." She paused. "Practical beginnings don't stay practical. Things grow. People change." She held his gaze. "I'm not the same person who walked into this house in July. Are you?" He looked at her for a long time. "No," he said. The carriage went on. Thomas slept. Emily watched the fields. And Benjamin and Abigail sat in the moving quiet of a late August afternoon, and let the distance between them be exactly what it was. Not the careful, managed distance of two people honoring an arrangement, but the different, smaller, charged distance of two people who have not yet moved but are no longer pretending they won't. When they reached the house, Mrs. Briggs was at the door before they'd stopped moving. She looked at their faces and knew she was too experienced a reader of human beings to need words, and she simply stepped aside to let them in and said, "Supper's ready when you are," in a voice that contained for the first time in Abigail's experience of her something entirely warm. Thomas woke up the moment the carriage stopped and declared himself starving, which was either a medical marvel or proof that anxiety burns a great deal of energy in 8-year-old boys. Emily went to the piano. She played for an hour, not Scales' actual music, a slow and intricate piece that Abigail didn't recognize, something that sounded like it had been composed for exactly this kind of day. It filled the house the way light fills a room when you open shutters that have been closed too long. Abigail stood in the hallway and listened. Benjamin came to stand beside her. They didn't touch. They didn't speak. They just stood there in their house and listened to music and let the day settle around them and understood without naming it, not quite yet, that something had ended today and something else had begun. Emily played for an hour that evening, and then she stopped, and the house held the silence afterward, the way a good vessel holds water carefully without spilling. Abigail stood in the hallway until the last note faded. Then she went to the kitchen, helped Mrs. Briggs with the supper things, without being asked, and said very little. Mrs. Briggs said very little back. But the older woman moved around her differently now, not making space for a stranger, but simply sharing a kitchen with someone who had earned her place in it. It was a small thing. It was everything. Thomas ate 3 portions and fell asleep at the table, which Benjamin handled by simply lifting him all 8 years and furious sleeping dignity of him and carrying him upstairs without comment. Emily watched her father go up the stairs with her brother and then looked at Abigail with the expression she wore when she was deciding whether to say something. "Say it," Abigail said. Emily almost smiled. "He looks different," she said. "Since the courthouse." "Different how?" "Less like he's holding his breath." She considered. "He's been holding his breath for a long time. Since before Mama died, I think. Since she started being sick." She looked at her hands on the table. "I didn't think he'd ever stop." Abigail looked at the girl who had stood in a courtroom at 12 years old and told the truth with a composure that had silenced the room. "He's getting there," Abigail said. Emily nodded. "So are you," she said quietly. Then she stood, kissed Abigail briefly on the cheek the first time she'd done that, the very first time, and it landed somewhere deep and irreversible and went upstairs. Abigail sat at the kitchen table for a long time after. Benjamin came back down. He didn't go to his study. He came to the kitchen doorway and looked at her and said, "The house is quiet." "It is." "That's new," he said. "The last time the house was quiet, it was the other kind." She understood. The empty kind, the after-a-fire kind as Emily had described it in the courtroom. "This is different," she agreed. He came in and sat across from her the same kitchen table where Mrs. Briggs had first told her about Charlotte's letters, where she had first started to understand the shape of the battle. It seemed appropriate somehow that they were here now. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't." "A proper conversation," he said. "One that isn't happening in a hallway or a crisis." He looked at her steadily. "We said after the hearing." "We did," she said. "The hearing is over." She held his gaze. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Not the managed quiet of a man suppressing feeling, but something more like the quiet of a man deciding for possibly the first time in years to simply say what was true. "I told you I was afraid of wanting something I didn't deserve," he said. "You asked me what would make me deserving." "I did. I've been thinking about it all evening." He folded his hands on the table. "And I think the answer is nothing. There is no action I can perform that would make me deserving of you. What you did for this family, what you built out of a practical arrangement, and 12 weeks of work and a great deal of patience with a man who is not easy." He stopped. "You don't earn something like that. You're either worthy of it or you're not, and I've been spending 3 months trying to determine which I am." She looked at him across the kitchen table. "And," she said. "I reckon," he said. And the word was deliberate, the small Western turn of phrase he almost never used, and it landed soft and real between them. "I'm going to try to be." She felt the whole weight of the past months shift just slightly, like a river changing course. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the inevitable consequence of a great deal of water moving in the same direction for a long time. "Benjamin," she said. "Abigail. That," she said, "is the most honest thing you've ever said to me." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, not with theater, just the particular opening of a man who has been very closed for a very long time and has finally carefully chosen not to be. "I'm going to need some practice at it," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be here while you practice." They sat at the kitchen table for another hour, talking in the low, unhurried way that people talk when there is nothing urgent anymore, and the urgency has been the language for so long that its absence feels like a new country. He told her about Catherine not as an explanation, not as a warning, but as a fact of his life that she was part of now and deserved to know fully. He told her about the years of her illness, the long, slow diminishment, the particular grief of losing someone gradually rather than suddenly. He told her that he had made a decision after Catherine died, that he would not go through that again, that he would not give that kind of access to another person, that the cost was more than he was willing to pay. She listened. She didn't rush him. She didn't offer comfort before he'd finished, which was the thing most people got wrong. When he was done, she said, "I understand the decision. I made a version of it myself after my parents died. You tell yourself the math doesn't work, that the loss is always bigger than the time you get." "Does the math work?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but people don't run on math." He almost smiled. "What do they run on? Stubbornness mostly," she said. "And the particular foolishness of caring about things anyway." He did smile then fully for the first time she'd seen it, the whole complicated face unlocking for just a moment, and it was nothing like she'd expected. It was unguarded and slightly crooked, and entirely human, and she thought, there he is. There is the actual man. She stored it carefully. The way you store the things that matter. September came. In the way September does in Massachusetts. Not gradually, but all at once, a single morning, where you wake up and the quality of the light has changed, and you know the way you know certain things in your body before your mind catches up, that summer is gone. Abigail noticed it from her window. She had a feeling standing there that something was also finishing in herself, some long internal season, some period of necessary proving that had been running since before she'd come to this house. Maybe since her parents died, and she'd had to learn that survival required a particular kind of hardness in the places where softness used to be. She stood at the window and felt that hardness quietly, slowly begin to ease. Thomas noticed September differently. He announced it at breakfast by informing everyone that the migratory birds would be moving south soon, and he intended to document them, and could Abigail please help him make a proper observation journal, because his handwriting was better when she showed him the correct grip. "Your handwriting is your own business," she said. "But yes, after lessons." "Before lessons," he negotiated. "During lessons," she said, "we'll incorporate it." He considered this compromise and found it acceptable, which meant he'd gotten what he wanted, and they both knew it. Emily had begun something that fall that Abigail noticed before anyone else did. She was writing. Not letters, not household lists, something longer, something private in a small journal she kept in her desk drawer. Abigail knew because she'd seen Emily close it once when she entered the room. She didn't ask about it. She understood from her own experience that a person's interior life needed room to exist before it needed an audience. But one afternoon, Emily came to her sitting room with the journal open and said, "I'd like to read you something, if you don't mind." "I don't mind at all," Abigail said. Emily sat in the chair beside the writing desk. Thomas's chair. She thought of it now, and also Benjamin's chair. Though it was just a chair, and she read. 3 paragraphs about the morning after the courthouse. About walking out into the August heat and feeling for the first time since November like the future was something she could look at directly. When Emily finished, she closed the journal and looked at Abigail with an expression that was anxious and brave in equal measure. "It's good," Abigail said. "It's genuinely good. The 3rd paragraph especially." Emily exhaled. "I thought maybe it was self-indulgent." "Feeling things is not self-indulgent," Abigail said. "Writing them down is how you understand what they are." She paused. "Don't stop." Emily nodded. She held the journal to her chest for a moment and then said without particular ceremony, "I'm glad you came to us." Abigail held that. "So am I," she said. The letter came on a Thursday in the 2nd week of September. It was addressed to Abigail, in Charlotte Winslow's handwriting. She opened it at her writing desk alone before she mentioned it to anyone. She needed to know what it said before she decided how to carry it. It was 2 pages. The handwriting was different from Charlotte's usual, less, even more effortful, the handwriting of someone who had written several drafts before arriving at this one. Charlotte began by acknowledging the court's decision. She did not contest it. She stated plainly that she intended to honor it. And then she said something that Abigail had not expected that sat her back in her chair and made her read the paragraph twice. Charlotte wrote that she had spent considerable time since the hearing thinking about what Emily had said in that courtroom. She wrote that she had been angry at first, furiously, bitterly angry. And then something had shifted in the way things shift in the very early morning when you've been awake all night and your defenses are down. She wrote that Emily had said love is not the same as what's best. She wrote that she had been thinking about that sentence for 2 weeks and had come to the painful understanding that it was true, and that she had confused the two things for a very long time, and that her daughter Catherine would likely have told her so if Catherine had believed it would be received. She did not apologize for the petition. She did not say she was wrong to fight. But she said, and this was the part that caught in Abigail's chest, that she hoped in time to have a different relationship with the children than the one the past 2 years had produced. She hoped to be a grandmother simply, without strategy, without claim. She said she understood if that was no longer possible. She said she was going to try anyway. She said the last line in different ink, like it had been added after the letter was otherwise complete, that she hoped Mrs. Hawthorne would consider letting her try. Abigail sat with the letter for a long time. Then she folded it, and she went to find Benjamin. She found him in his study working, and she closed the door behind her and handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. She watched his face while he did the careful movement through it, the particular stillness when he reached the end. He set it down. "Well," he said. "She means it," Abigail said. "I think she genuinely means it. She also genuinely meant to take my children." His voice wasn't harsh, just precise. "Yes," Abigail said. "Both things are true." He looked at the letter. "What do you think we should do?" She had been thinking about it since the kitchen table. "I think Emily should decide," she said, "and Thomas. They're the ones she wants a relationship with. It should be their choice." He looked at her. "And if they say no, then we tell Charlotte no, and we don't revisit it." She met his eyes. "And if they say yes, we give it a very long rope, small visits, their terms, nothing Charlotte gets to control." He thought about it, nodded slowly. "You'd allow it," he said, "after everything she did." "I'm not allowing it for Charlotte," Abigail said. "I'm allowing it for the children if it's what they want. They lost their mother. Their grandmother is the last person alive who knew Catherine as a young woman." She paused. "That's worth something. Even complicated, even difficult, it's worth something." Benjamin looked at her for a long moment. With that look, the one she'd been collecting since July. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "See the thing worth keeping in the thing that tried to hurt you." She considered. "I reckon," she said, deliberate, with the word, watching his face. "It's because I've needed people to do it for me, and someone always has." His expression did something quiet and complete. "Ask the children," she said. "Tonight at dinner. Ask them together." He did. Thomas's response, delivered between bites of his second serving of potato, was characteristically direct. "I don't want to go to Boston. But if she comes here and she's not going to do that lawyer thing again, I reckon I'd see her." Emily took longer. She turned her water glass in her hands, looking at it, and the table was patient while she thought. "I don't want to lose her completely," Emily said finally. She's not all bad. She searched for it. She loved Mama in a way that didn't leave enough room for anyone else. And I understand that a little, because I know how it is to love someone and be afraid of losing them." She looked up. "I'd like to try. With rules." "With rules," Benjamin agreed. Thomas pointed his fork at his father. "I get to make some of the rules." "A few of them," Benjamin said. Thomas seemed satisfied. After dinner, Benjamin sat down and wrote a reply to Charlotte. Abigail sat beside him while he wrote, not directing, not editing, just present the way you're present for someone doing something hard. He wrote that the children had been consulted and had expressed willingness to maintain a relationship under clear conditions. He wrote the conditions. He wrote that this was the children's decision and would remain so. He wrote that he hoped for their sake she would honor it. He signed it, handed it to Abigail. She read it. "It's good," she said. "It's exactly right." He sealed it. "Charlotte Winslow," he said. is going to have to become someone different if she wants what she's asking for. People do that sometimes, Abigail said. Become different. He looked at her sideways. You're thinking about me. I'm thinking about both of you, she said. He laughed. It was quiet and brief and genuine, and she felt it go through the room like the first warm day after a long winter. The weeks that followed had the quality of something setting. Like plaster hardening. Like a structure finding its final form after the scaffolding comes down. The household moved through September and into October with the ease of a household that had learned its own rhythms, who needed what in the morning, which problems could wait, and which couldn't, how to navigate Thomas's periodically explosive opinions about everything, and Emily's quiet periodic withdrawals, and Benjamin's instinct still present but diminishing to manage feeling rather than experience it. Abigail moved through those weeks with a different quality of attention than she'd brought to the summer. In the summer, she'd been watching for threat-building documentation, anticipating Charlotte calculating risks. Now she had the particular unfamiliar luxury of watching things simply because they were worth watching. Thomas discovering with genuine scientific passion that the red-tailed hawk nested in the north pasture. Emily's journal growing thicker, her handwriting growing freer. Benjamin one evening laughing at something Thomas said for a full 10 seconds, not the suppressed, not quite laugh she'd catalogued in July, but the real thing. She also watched something grow between herself and Benjamin. Not dramatically. Not with any of the declarations she'd read about in the novels she'd borrowed from the Hammond family library during her governess years. Nothing like that. It grew the way actual things grow slowly from the root in the dark before there's anything visible to point at. He began to leave his study door open in the evenings. She began to leave her sitting room door open too. They didn't always speak, but the open doors said something neither of them had said yet, and they both understood the language. One evening in early October she was in the garden. Not working, simply standing in it, in the way you stand in a place when you need to remember it belongs to you, is yours to inhabit. She'd been doing this more often, claiming small things, the way a person does when they've stopped bracing for loss. She heard the door. She heard his steps. Benjamin came to stand beside her. He was still in his shirt sleeves. He'd left his coat inside somewhere. Another signal she filed away, and he stood next to her without ceremony and looked at what she was looking at, which was nothing specific, just the October evening, just the cooling air. Thomas is asleep, he said. Already. He was up before 5 to watch for the hawk. It caught up with him. She almost smiled. And Emily, writing. He paused. That journal of hers. She showed me a page tonight. Abigail looked at him. What did you think? I think she's a better writer than I am, he said. And I think she's going to be extraordinary. Whatever she does with herself. His voice was quiet and entirely unguarded, the way it only got with his children. I think Catherine would have known how to tell her that properly. I'm not as good at it. Tell her anyway, Abigail said. Imperfectly. She'll hear what you mean. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to practice that too. The honest thing. All of it, he said. They stood together in the October evening. The trees were turning the maples first, then the oaks, and the air had the particular smell of leaf fall and cooling soil and something underneath that was almost winter but not yet. I have been thinking, he said, about what I said in the kitchen, about trying to be worthy. I remember. I've decided I'm going about it wrong, he said. She looked at him and he continued. I've been treating it as a problem to solve, a threshold to cross, something I have to earn through performance. He paused. That's the wrong approach. What's the right one? She said. He turned toward her. Not dramatically, just a shift of weight, a turning of his whole self toward her, the way a compass finds north, quiet and inevitable. Just this, he said. Being here, being honest, not managing the distance anymore. She looked up at him. I love you, he said. Plain as anything. Plain as a man who has finally stopped treating the truth as a negotiation. I don't mean it as a declaration I need you to respond to. I mean it as a fact I've been aware of for a while and have been handling badly. The evening was very still. She felt the sentence land in her, not as a shock, because she'd felt the shape of it coming for weeks. but as the particular full-bodied recognition of something you've been moving toward and have just finally reached. "Benjamin," she said. "You don't have to. I love you too," she said. "I've been being practical about it, filing it under things I wasn't going to name yet." She looked at him. "I'm done being practical about it." Something broke open in him. The last of it. The last careful management. And he reached out and took her face in his hands and looked at her the way you look at something you've been afraid to believe is real. His hands were warm. His eyes were open, fully open, no glass between them and her. "Abigail," he said, and her name in his mouth was different from every other time he'd said it. It was the sound of a man saying not just a name, but everything the name had come to contain. She put her hand against his chest. She felt his heart beating. Not steady and controlled as she'd expected, but fast. Genuinely fast, the heart of a man who is not it turns out nearly as contained as he appears. "You're nervous," she said, a little amazed. "Significantly," he said. She laughed, real and warm and fully hers, and he pulled her in and held her, and she let herself be held, and they stood together in the October garden while the maples turned and the air went cool, and the house behind them held its breath in the best possible way. He pressed his lips to her hair. She closed her eyes. This was not what she had expected when she walked into Hawthorne Manor in July with a borrowed dress and a winter blanket she hadn't asked for. She had expected to be competent. She had expected to be useful. She had expected maybe to find something that looked like home without quite being it. She had not expected this. A month later, a letter arrived from Charlotte. It was brief. She thanked them for the reply to her previous letter. She said she would like to visit in November if the children were willing. She said she would bring no lawyer. She said she understood the rules. She said the last line in this one wasn't an afterthought. This one was the whole point of the letter, that she had been thinking about what Abigail said in the courtroom, that the children had done it, that she was coming to understand the difference. Abigail brought the letter to dinner. She read it to all four of them. Thomas, Emily, Benjamin herself, the four of them around the table the way they were every evening now, the way she expected they would be for a long time to come. Thomas listened with his arms crossed, his serious thinking expression deployed at full force. Then he said, "She can come, but I'm not calling her anything other than Mrs. Winslow for at least a month." Emily smiled, a real smile, slightly sideways, her mother's smile Abigail had come to understand. "That seems fair." Benjamin looked at Abigail across the table. She looked back at him. He reached over without ceremony and took her hand and held it in full view of both children, which made Thomas make a face, and Emily deliberately look at her plate in the way of a person who is pleased and pretending not to be. "Write back," Benjamin said. "Tell her November is fine." Abigail wrote back that evening. Charlotte came in the third week of November in the same hired carriage, and she came with no lawyer and no agenda, and she sat at the Hawthorne table and ate dinner, and listened to Thomas's extensive analysis of hawk migration patterns, and she told Emily that her posture reminded her of Catherine at the same age. And Emily received this with the quiet grace of a girl who has learned that grief and gratitude can live in the same moment without canceling each other. It was not simple. It was not without its friction. Charlotte was not a woman who had changed entirely, and some of her old habits surfaced in small ways that Abigail noticed and chose not to react to, because reaction wasn't always the right tool. But it was real. It was the beginning of something that might, with enough time and enough honesty, become something worth having. After Charlotte left, Thomas came to find Abigail in her sitting room. He stood in the doorway with his bird journal under his arm, looking contemplative. "She's not as bad as she was," he announced. "People can change," Abigail said. He considered this. "You really believe that?" "I do. Even when they've done bad things. Even then, if they're willing to do the work." She looked at him. "Are you going to make her do the work?" "Absolutely," he said with complete serenity. She pressed her lips together to keep the smile contained. He crossed the room, climbed onto the chair, his chair she'd stopped pretending it was anyone else's, and opened his bird journal. "Will you check my hawk observations? I think I may have miscounted the tail feathers in my diagram." You can't count tail feathers on a flying hawk, Thomas. I estimated. Then we'll call it an estimate. I call it science. She took the journal from him and looked at his meticulous, ink-smudged documentation of the red-tailed hawk of the North Pasture. And she thought about all the things that had happened in this house since a July morning when she pressed her hand against a bedroom door and held her breath and didn't know what was coming. She had come with nothing she could name as her own. She had come practical and careful and armored with competence because that was what she had. She had built a household. She had fought a battle. She had watched a family come back from its own wreckage. She had loved a man who needed considerable time to let himself be loved, and she had given him that time because she understood what it was to need it. She had found without looking for it the thing she hadn't known she was missing, not safety, not comfort, not even love in the simple sense, but the specific irreplaceable sense of mattering to people in a way that was permanent. The sense of being the kind of person whose presence changes things. December came. The first snow fell on a Saturday, which Thomas considered a personal gift from the universe, and Emily considered a reasonable meteorological event, and Benjamin considered a reason to build a fire and stay in for the afternoon, which was the Hawthorne family version of celebration. They were all in the front room. Thomas by the window, watching the snow with proprietary satisfaction. Emily at the piano playing something gentle and unhurried. Abigail reading beside the fire, Benjamin in the chair across from her with his accounts that he was not actually working on because he kept looking up at her. She felt his gaze. She had felt it for months. She looked up from her book. He was looking at her with the full open look, the one that had no glass in it, and he said nothing. He didn't need to. He had practiced the honest thing and gotten good at it, and the honest thing now was sometimes just this, looking at her across a firelit room in December with the snow coming down outside and his children making their particular sounds around them, and letting his face say what his heart meant. She looked back at him. Thomas said from the window. It's settling. That means at least 2 inches. I want to be the first one out in it tomorrow. You'll freeze, Emily said without stopping playing. I'll be documented, Thomas corrected. There's a difference. Abigail lowered her book. Benjamin was still looking at her. 2 inches, she said to him quietly. How does the North Pasture look with 2 inches of snow? Beautiful, he said. And he was not talking about the North Pasture. She understood that. She understood him. She had spent 5 months learning the language of a man who had forgotten he was allowed to speak it, and now she was fluent, and so was he, and the conversation between them ran beneath everything else like a current that kept the whole house warm. She picked her book back up. He went back to his accounts. The snow kept falling. Emily played. Thomas documented. And in the particular ordinary, extraordinary quiet of a December afternoon, in a house that had once been empty of warmth and was no longer Abigail Hawthorne, understood with the complete and settled certainty of a woman who has earned every inch of what she knows, that this was not a practical arrangement anymore. This was a life, her life, built from nothing she had planned and everything she had chosen one honest day at a time. And she would not trade a single difficult moment of it for anything the world had to offer. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she had known it in the deepest honest place inside her, from the moment a man she barely knew slid a folded blanket under her door in the middle of summer and walked away without asking for a thing. That one gentle act had not just changed a wedding night, it had built a home.